Yo guys, welcome to the Zelda fiction. Today we are gonna see, what if Shino fell in love with Fem Naruto? Huge shout out to Mekon-chan for this story. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Naru watched sullenly as the other children played with each other. They thought she was too shy or stuck up to talk with them. Ha. Shy. Her. Naru was a naturally bubbly person. But, Naru frowned, thinking, Gigi said that the other kids wouldn't understand sign language. Naru had no friends all the school year so far because of the communication barrier between her and her class, and it was already halfway through. It was incredibly frustrating for Naru. Incredibly. Naru was sure that if the kids her age were more observant they would see. And if they noticed, they would surely say something, right? Naru couldn't say anything about it. But after that first out of the blue conversation, they would be on the fast track to best friends. Right? Naru didn't know. But, she thought optimistically, it was sure to happen eventually. Naru climbed up a nearby tree in a bout of restless energy. This went unnoticed by all in the schoolyard, of course. The blonde 8-year-old girl sat on the uppermost branch and watched the other students again. It was the only thing she could do, besides pulling pranks. But she had no supplies with her right now, having been detained by her kind but strict teacher. And besides, if she couldn't talk to her classmates, she could observe them, right? Hiba was sort of like her, she thought. There were quite a few prime differences though, mainly being his mild arrogance and big mouth. Hinata was a girl Naru thought would be a nice friend. But she was awfully shy and stuttered constantly. Sasuke was arrogant and stoic, while Ino and Sakura were people she found annoying. Them both and the rest of Sasuke's fangirls. Shikamaru was lazy and smart, while Choji was loyal and had a big heart. They made good best friends. Naru absent-mindedly wished she had someone like that, but brushed the thought away. Turning her gaze to the last figure she recognized from her class, Naru frowned. The dark brown-haired boy wearing a high collar was a mystery to her. His name was Shino and, like her, had no friends to speak of. The others made it obvious they found him creepy, so they stayed away. Naru had heard from a student's conversation that he was an Aburame, whatever that was. She didn't know about clan names or the abilities ties to them. Jumping down from the tree clumsily, she determinedly made her way back inside to the library. It wasn't her favorite place in the world with all those books, but she was willing to give up her lunch break to find out about these so-called Aburame and why they were avoided like the plague. Naru flipped another ninja information book on the floor lethargically. This was really boring. And she couldn't find information on the Aburame clan. Well, at least more than a passing mention. The blonde got up with an inaudible sigh to put back the book she had looked over and grab some more. Maybe she wasn't looking in the right section. Naru put away a book titled Ninja History of Konoha in the end section. She stood back and looked at the wall of books. Then, she slapped her forehead and mentally berated herself, moving towards the A section. I've been looking for a general book on all ninja clans. There's probably an in-depth one just about the Aburame available. I'm such a dolt sometimes. Sure enough, right in front of her was a ridiculously thin book labeled, What We Know About the Aburame. Naru grinned in victory and took it down from the shelf. Skipping back to her seat in the corner, she quickly opened the crisply unused book and started reading. Naru stomped her foot in frustration. That What We Know About the Aburame book knew barely anything about Aburames. Really, all it said was that Aburames had a special ability that enabled them to hold colonies of special bugs in their bodies. Just in not as little words. If Naru was anything, she was curious. And this did not satisfy her curiosity. And it sounded really cool to have bugs living in your body, Naru thought. Was that why everyone avoided Shino? Because he had bugs in him? That was a stupid reason. Just cause Aburame are different doesn't mean they should be outcasts. And Naru knew a thing or two about being different and an outcast. Looking up, she sighed impatiently, pushing her thoughts to the side for a moment. She was waiting to be paired up with another student from her class for their first survival training expedition. Their sensei for their whole time at the academy, Iruka, was going down the list of pre-arranged teams of 2, calling them forward and handing them their academy grade tents and food bag. The class had been learning about setting up camp and outdoor survival for 2 months now, and it was time to put it to the test. Uzumaki, Naru and Iruka started reading the next team. Naru perked up at hearing her name, Aburame Shino. She glanced over at the quiet boy she had been contemplating most of the day. He turned his head in her direction for a second, the only way she could tell he was looking her way because of his dark shades, his expression impossible to read. Then he turned to the senseis and walked forward to take the tent, leaving the food bag to Naru. As Naru moved forward she heard the usual whispers directed at her. She doesn't ever talk. What a weirdo. Sometimes Naru wished she could talk just to tell them she was mute, dang it. Naru took the food backpack from Iruka and gave him a dazzling grin. "You'll be okay, Naru?" he asked worriedly. He knew she was mute and was the only teacher kind enough to ask, even though Naru couldn't reply. No one thought to learn sign language anymore. Well, at least anyone below Jounin level. The blonde girl nodded to his question, sending the kind-hearted man a reassuring smile. Joining Shino at the edge of the academy yard, she grew frustrated again. There were so many questions the curious Uzumaki wanted to ask the mysterious boy about his clan. The tugging at the back of her subconscious notified her that she was being watched. Glancing at her silent companion, she found him studying her from behind his sunglasses. His tense, closed-off stance showed he was thinking hard about something. Not being able to talk has forced Naru to pick up on details like such, whether she wanted to or not. The blonde gave the supposed bug user a curious look and he shook his head in reply, turning away. What did that mean? Naru waited with Shino as the rest of the class was paired up. They were instructed to find a spot to camp for the night in the forest over the Hokage mountain. Shino moved forward, but instead of following after the other teams that were headed to the mountain, he stood beside the gate and waited for them to pass before turning to Naru. He was silent for a moment, but Naru had a feeling he was going to say something. "You're mute." Naru blinked for a moment. Then she nodded, waiting for what else he had to say. "None of the others notice, because they are not mature enough to look beyond themselves," he stated. Again, Naru nodded, this time more sadly. Shino fell silent again. Naru rocked back and forth on her heels. She supposed that if she could talk she'd ramble on about something to break the silence. "How do you communicate, then?" he asked, sounding slightly less stiff. "Sign language," she signed with her hands. He watched for a moment. "I have never learned sign language," he said after a moment. Then he paused almost uncertainly for a moment. "I am sorry." Naru was stunned. No one had ever apologized for not knowing sign language. Mostly they just brushed her off and assumed she was fine with not imputing in the conversation. Then, she grinned brightly at him. This boy wasn't creepy at all, he was actually quite thoughtful of others. Naru saw his cheeks rise slightly from under his collar and assumed he was smiling back at her. He looked even more comfortable now. "We should get going. We will be the last ones up there at this rate." Naru walked beside the brown-haired Aburame for a moment, then stopped and tugged on his sleeve. He looked at her through his dark glasses calmly, but Naru had the distinct impression that he was startled. Naru was confused over it for a moment before remembering what little she had learned from the book she read earlier. People usually shied away from Aburames. "Yes?" he asked, stopping beside her. Naru looked around for something to write on. A nearby stick sufficed for her purpose. "I know a shortcut," she wrote in the dirt. Shino raised an eyebrow at her. "You do? Is it safe?" Naru bobbed her head frantically. Shino seemed to contemplate for a moment, then nodded to her in return. "Very well." The girl grinned and started walking towards the mountain, then stopped again and wrote something else. "Do you mind if we stop by my apartment? I need to grab something to write on." "That is fine, as long as it doesn't take long to get there." Naru nodded again and resumed walking in the same direction. Her apartment was on the way. They walked quietly until they came to Naru's rundown living quarters. Naru peeked nervously over at Shino, waiting with apprehension for the insult to her home. But Shino did not say anything. He only surveyed the place as he followed her in, seemingly contemplating once more. Naru grabbed her orange pen and pad of paper from her table in her one-room place. Well, 2 rooms, counting the bathroom. Then, as she turned back to her companion, he finally asked a question. "You live alone?" Naru paused and then nodded. Shino looked a tad uncomfortable in asking, like he was afraid of offending the girl. Naru hurried to reassure him, scribbling a few sentences on her paper and handing it to him. "I don't mind your questions. I don't get to talk to people often, so it's fine." His shoulders released some tension after he finished reading. He looked back up at her and handed back the notebook. Naru moved towards the door and he followed, somewhat hesitantly asking his next question. "What about your parents?" Naru paused and almost refused to answer the question. But she had already told Shino that she didn't mind his questions. And she was not going to miss this opportunity to make a friend. "I don't have any." "They died, then?" Naru looked over at him. He was obviously trying to be as gentle and tactful as possible. He knew he was treading on sensitive territory. Yet he was making an effort to keep up the conversation. She'd have to ask him why. "I don't know," she wrote, answering his question. "I never knew them. I've been alone as long as I can remember." "I see. Why do you keep talking to me?" she asked next. "I apologize," he said, looking more flustered than she'd ever saw him, which wasn't saying much. "Does it bother you?" Naru shook her head energetically, cutting him off before he could say more. "No, it's really nice, actually. It's just." "Just what?" Shino asked, following her down the unused path beside the one up to the Hokage monument. Naru shifted uncomfortably as she handed him the pad of paper once again. It's just no one else has made an effort to keep up the conversation for so long. Most people get bored with reading half the conversation and sorta brush you off. He supplied. Naru nodded again. I know how it feels. He said simply, looking away for a moment. Naru was confused for a moment. He knew how it felt. Why would someone brush off such a thoughtful boy? Naru had only known him for under an hour and she was sure she really liked him. Then she remembered, once again, that Shino was an Aburame. She remembered the question she wanted to ask. She started scribbling furiously, attracting Shino's attention back to her. You're an Aburame, right? I was reading about your clan today, but the only book I found didn't explain anything. Do you really have bugs inside your body? How does that work? It sounds really cool. She handed the pad to Shino, who stopped walking suddenly after he started reading. While his shaded eyes flew across the page, Naru noticed that they were now in the forest above the Hokage monument. In the perfect spot for camp, too. Naru noticed Shino staring at her again. It was like he couldn't quite figure her out. You think it's cool? He asked finally. Naru nodded hesitantly. She grabbed the paper back to write her next message. I'm sorry. Are you mad? Shino made a chocked sound when she handed him the paper once more. Mad? No, I was just surprised. Most people aren't interested in the Aburame and are irrationally afraid of bugs. Yes, I do have bugs in my body, but it's only a half a colony. I'll get a full colony when I graduate to Genin status. As for how it works, it's a special process that we Aburame undergo when we are born. It's not really something I can explain. Naru sighed in relief when he admitted he was not mad at her and listened intently to his response to her questions. We need to set up this tent before it gets much darker out. Shino stated, changing the subject to a more pressing issue. Naru nodded and happily helped him take the shelter out of the bag. The tent was simple, if a bit worn, and only took the duo a minute to set up. Then they sat at the entrance and wondered vaguely what to do. Shino cleared his throat after a moment to catch Naru's attention. He raised a hand uncertainly. I need to do my daily practice with my Kikai bugs. Do you mind? Naru shook her head quickly. She was very interested to see how he controlled the tiny insects. She leaned forward slightly to watch. Shino seemed unnerved at her obvious interest for a second, then shrugged it off, apparently deciding to act as if she wasn't there. Naru's silent mouth dropped open in unabashed awe at the small swarm of bugs that came out of Shino's sleeve. He waved his arm and the swarm responded accordingly, moving in loops and jagged lines. It seemed awfully complicated to Naru, but Shino only seemed to be concentrating mildly. She concluded that he must have practiced a lot. After he finished he looked to see Naru's reaction, hoping she hadn't changed her mind and instead thought he was creepy like the rest of the class did. Shino hadn't had friends before, only his family for company. Shino secretly desperately wanted someone who would be a friend to him. When Shino turned to Naru, she gave him a 100-watt foxy smile. She thought Shino's abilities were super amazing and told him so on her pad of paper. Shino stared at the paper for a moment thoughtfully. Then, he looked back up at her and gave a small, sincere smile. Thank you. The two watched the sun dip below the horizon in companionable silence. Then, just before Shino opened his mouth to say we should get to sleep, Naru shoved the pad of paper into his hands and looked away, nervously wringing her hands. Shino looked down and read the last line she wrote. When Naru heard a soft intake of breath, she turned around to face him again, anxiously awaiting his answer. Wanna be friends? Shino read it over and over, not quite believing it the first time. The unbelieving, shocked side of him wanted to think that she didn't really mean it. Then, the logical side of him knew that she wouldn't have written it if she didn't mean it. Shino was very aware that writing something down was different than saying it. When writing something, you have to consciously think about it, you can't blurt it out without thought. Then, there was a part of Shino that didn't care about logic or shock. That part was thinking. This is my chance to have a friend. Shino looked up at the girl. A good friend. Naru was starting to lose hope from his lack of reaction. Maybe she had asked too soon. She had just met him formally today. But Naru was so glad to have someone who didn't judge her right off the bat for being mute, she just couldn't help herself. But, when he finally looked up from the note, she knew that he felt as much a connection to her and she felt to him. Yes. He stated, a hint of a smile in his voice, yes, I would very much like to be friends. When Naru and Shino returned to class the next day with their pristinely folded tent and empty food bag, they had already developed a strong friendship. Shino had never much felt the need to talk before yesterday, but with Naru, he wanted to talk to her and learn about her. However, he was by no means chatty. Shino knew instinctively that he had made a friend that would stay by him through thick and thin, and he wanted to repay that as best he could. Naru, on the other hand, was on cloud 9. The dazzling grin never left her face for even a moment on the way back to the academy. She had a friend. Her best and only friend. The energetic blonde couldn't be happier. Sure, Shino wasn't much of a talker, but he spoke just enough that it was comfortable, and he truly made an effort to converse with her, even though her responses were on paper. Naru practically skipped to where Iruka and Mizuki were waiting. She heard Shino snort quietly and saw him shake his head, amused despite himself. Then he spotted the other students huddled around and stiffened. Naru noticed and stopped skipping, waiting for him to catch up. She gave him a slightly worried look. The 8-year-old girl noticed how rigid and deathly quiet he had gotten and was instantly confused. Had she done something that made him retract back into his shell that she was slowly but surely drawing him out of? Naru handed the empty food bag to Iruka while Shino gave the tent to Mizuki. Mizuki speared Naru's turn back with a subdued glare, though it did not miss Shino's notice. The bug user frowned heavily, but he did not say anything. Naru sent a sweet smile to the kinder of the teachers before moving to the side with Shino. Shino was still silent, much more so than when it was just she and him. The blonde was getting very concerned. Shino caught her anxious look and noticed with a start that he had been acting differently since they had arrived at the academy. He hurried to reassure her. "I apologize. It is nothing you did." He started quietly. These words were meant only for her. "I did not realize until just now that I had stopped talking with you. I do not enjoy being around so many people, so I suppose that my silence was just a reflex reaction." Naru nodded in understanding. Naru liked people, but most of them mocked her. Her reflex was to shy away from nasty expressions, so she tended to stay away from most the Konoha population. She didn't know why people didn't like her. Was it because she was mute? Or something else? The blonde pushed aside the depressing thoughts and let herself be herded with the other students inside. She perked up some when she remembered that she now had a friend that understood the feeling of being shunned completely. "Alright, everyone," Iruka yelled, grabbing the students' attention, "take your seats." Naru bounced to her regular seat, which had a wide berth. No one wanted to sit by the creepy girl who didn't. She looked up and saw Shino hesitate at the front of the classroom. Then, he walked up to Iruka's desk and asked something politely in a low voice. Iruka smiled at him and said something back just as quietly. When Shino responded, Iruka's face showed open shock, then happiness, and he nodded quickly with an even bigger smile. The Aburame boy nodded back curtly and turned around, heading up the stairs to Naru's row. He took the seat beside her and caught her curious look. "I asked Iruka-sensei if I could move seats," he explained. "Is it alright if I sit here?" Naru nodded back fervently, grinning happily. His shoulders untensed some at her approval, and he turned back to the front to listen to the lesson. Naru took after Shino's example and tried her very best to listen to what Mizuki was explaining. But, considering it was a history lesson, she was having a very hard time concentrating. Truthfully, the only thing she didn't have a hard time concentrating on was the trap techniques that Iruka told the class about. It helped a lot with the pranks she executed from time to time. Plus she found it fascinating. She realized that she had been lost in her thoughts for longer than a moment and that the rest of the class was lining up to practice the jutsu they had learned a few weeks ago. Shino had been waiting patiently for. She stood up and walked with him to the end of the line, though it didn't really matter their position, Iruka would call them at random anyway. Uchiha Sasuke was called up first and performed a perfect bunshin, their newest jutsu, which earned several fangirl squeals and reluctantly impressed whispers. He smirked smugly, which irked Naru. He thought he was so cool, the jerk. Naru watched as other students were called up with growing nervousness. She was never really good at jutsu, even the easiest ones. Shino was called up and did just as well as Sasuke, though he was not smug about it. He knew that there was always room for improvement and making one bunshin wasn't a huge cause to celebrate. Finally, Naru's name was called and she walked to the front with dread. She took a deep breath and started doing the correct hand signs. She channeled her chakra and tried to do the technique. She only ended up with a loud crackling sound and her hands feeling like they had caught fire momentarily. She bit her lip from the pain of the burns on her hands and swallowed back the traitor tears that came to her eyes. Some of the students sniggered behind their hands, blatantly oblivious to her pain. She curled her hands into fists at her sides to hide the burns. Iruka smiled sadly down at her. "Good try, Naru. Maybe next time." Naru nodded, not looking him in the eye as she returned to her place. Humiliation weighed her shoulders down as she heard more of her classmates whispering about her. This usually happened when she attempted a jutsu. "Are you alright?" Shino asked softly from beside her, a hint of concern etched in his voice. The blonde wavered for a moment, then shook her head no, looking up to meet his black glasses. She held up her hands to him, uncurling her fingers hesitantly. He inhaled sharply when he saw the fire-red welts, looking back up at her. "Does this happen every time you try a jutsu?" Naru nodded. She didn't know why, it just did. The bug user examined her palms gently for a moment longer, not paying attention to the rest of the students. Then he looked up at Naru again and noted her teary eyes. He imagined that it hurt a lot. From what he knew about injuries, these burns on her hands were chakra burns, which stung more than regular fire burns. As much as he would rather not, he knew he had to speak up and ask to bring her to the nurse. He released her battered hands and took a deep breath. Naru wondered what he was doing when he turned back to the front, facing Iruka-sensei. Then, she was shocked when he cleared his throat, capturing the attention of many of their classmates and their sensei. "Yes, Shino?" Iruka asked, as surprised as the students that he had made any noise while class was in session. Shino really had been quite the introverted kid. At least, the kid Iruka saw. He was sure, however, that he had seen the Aburame boy talking to Naru earlier. Shino shifted for a moment, then said flatly, "Naru has burned her hands from attempting the bunshin. May I take her to the nurse?" There was an instant abundance of whispering. Since when are those two friends? It fits. They're both really weird and barely talk and, from the nicer of students, she burned her hands. I didn't even notice. Shino ignored this in favor of waiting for Iruka's response. Iruka himself was saddened and glad at the same time. Glad because he could tell that the sweet blonde had finally found a good friend. Sad because said friend was the only one that even noticed that she was hurt and was concerned enough to make mention of it. "Yes, of course. Thank you for offering," Iruka said kindly, gesturing to the door. Shino nodded, turning on his heel. He gently grabbed Naru's wrist, careful to avoid the welts, and led her to the door. Naru was shocked. Hadn't Shino said earlier that he was uncomfortable in front of so many people? Had he actually spoken up for her? Her heart was warmed by his compassion and thoughtfulness. Naru grinned at the boy, who had let go of her wrist and was walking with her to the nurse's office. Shino tilted his head at her, confused at her sudden change in mood. Had she forgotten about the abused skin on her hands? It seemed that the cheerful girl couldn't stay anything but happy for very long. They walked in silence, though not by choice for Naru. She wanted to thank her new friend, but she couldn't talk, he didn't understand sign language, and she couldn't write with burned hands. She resigned herself to waiting until she was healed. They finally reached the small office where the nurse was already occupied with a small black-haired boy about a year older than the both of them. He was getting his knee bandaged by the kind old lady who was employed as the school nurse, talking a mile a minute all the while. He was the one that noticed their approach first, halting abruptly in his chatting. Then he practically jumped off the bench he was sitting on, waving merrily to them. "Hi. Are you here to see Cho-san too? I scraped my knee during Jutsu practice today. It did not hurt too much, but my teacher sent me here anyway. Why are you both here?" Naru and Shino glanced at each other, startled by the sudden energy and rambunctiousness of this older boy. Then Shino looked back at the boy, who was waiting eagerly for one of them to speak up. Shino continued walking forward after a moment, speaking up to answer the boy. "She burned her hands during class." "Oh," the boy said, genuinely sympathetic, "I'm sorry. Does it hurt a lot?" He was looking straight at Naru, obviously expecting her to answer. Naru shifted uncomfortably, looking to where Shino had started explaining the situation to the nurse. Then she looked back at the boy, who was still staring at her unwaveringly. "What is wrong?" he asked when she didn't say anything. "Why will you not talk to me?" "Naru-chan, come here." The nurse said, "I'll put some healing cream on that and it'll be good as new." "Is that your name?" "Naru?" the boy asked, his round eyes even wider. "Yes." Shino answered for her as she let the nurse apply the ointment. "She's Uzumaki Naru, I am Aburame Shino." "I am Rock Lee," he said with a dazzling grin. It diminished somewhat when he realized that Naru still hadn't said anything. He gazed mournfully at her as she walked back over to him, her hands healing themselves quickly with the aid of the balm. "Why will you not talk to me?" he repeated, "did I do something wrong?" Naru's eyes widened in alarm. She didn't want him blaming himself. She sent Shino a pleading glance, which he correctly interpreted. "It is not of any fault of yours, she cannot talk," the younger of the boys said, stuffing his hands in his pockets. Shino didn't seem too at ease to Naru, but less tense than he was when they were in class. Lee's eyes widened in realization. He turned to the girl, who was shifting uncomfortably. "I am sorry. I did not realize." Naru smiled at the energetic boy, getting a blinding grin in response. The trio started walking back down the hall together. Naru thought that Lee seemed like a nice boy. Maybe they could be friends. "So, how did you burn your hands, Naru-chan?" Naru dropped her head in shame. She couldn't even perform a simple jutsu and ended up getting hurt in the process. Lee and Shino both noticed her sudden depressed aura, and Lee looked to Shino in alarm. "What? What did I say?" Shino shook his head and stopped walking. He put a hand hesitantly on his friend's shoulder. She looked up at him for a moment then looked away, but he caught the humiliation in her expressive eyes. "Naru?" he asked quietly, for the moment ignoring Lee. The older boy noticed that this was not a moment he should interfere in. The girl shook her head at him, still not. With a start he realized that she was ashamed that she messed up the jutsu and hurt herself. Is this about what happened in class? It wasn't your fault. She looked at him at this. Then she grabbed the pad of paper and pen she had stored in her back pocket and started writing. I don't why that always happens. There has to be something wrong with me that never happens to anyone else. Shino shook his head at her, still frowning. No, there is not anything wrong with you. I think it's just harder for you because you can't talk. My parents once told me that you should not attempt a jutsu without saying the name until you know it very well. Speaking the name helps you concentrate your energy. Naru thought for a moment with a frown. Do you think that's it? I'm almost positive. But I can check with my parents tonight if you would like me to. Naru smiled brightly at him for a moment, then dimmed again. What am I going to do then? If I can't do jutsu, how will I be a ninja? Shino pondered her question for a moment and couldn't honestly come up with an answer on the spot. Lee was looking between them, distressed that he made the younger girl upset. What is going on? He asked hesitantly. Shino looked to Naru, waiting for her permission to explain. When she nodded he spoke. Naru burned her hands because she can't say the name of the jutsu we were practicing. It made her chakra go awry and scorch her hands. I suppose your question bothered her because she is somewhat well. Shino glanced at Naru, unable to describe her feelings for her. When Naru looked to Lee to see what his reaction was, she was very surprised to see he had an understanding, if not emphatic, look on his face. I guess that is similar to my situation then, he said, somewhat sadly. I cannot do jutsu either, though it is because I am unable to focus my chakra significantly. Naru's mouth dropped open in surprise. She was eager to hear what the older boy had to say now. But you know what I have learned. Lee said, perking up again, I know now that I cannot give up. Just because I cannot do jutsu does not mean I am unable to be a ninja. I will become one, that is a promise. There was silence as both Naru and Shino processed the elder's words. Then Shino, the only of the two that could, spoke up. Then how will you be a good ninja without jutsu? It is the basis of being a ninja. I have wondered the same thing, Lee admitted, but just a few months ago I figured that I do not need to use jutsu if I could be the best at something I am already good at. So you plan to specialize in something? Yes. Lee said confidently. All three were quiet. Naru was contemplating Lee's solution. She supposed it was a good idea. A very good idea, actually. Then Lee suddenly jumped, looking down the hall frantically. Oh. I am sorry, but I have to go. My teacher said to be back before lunch, and it is already halfway through. He looked to them, I shall see you another day. Naru and Shino both nodded. Lee smiled one last time before dashing down the hall at top speed. The duo watched for a moment before resuming to walk. They were silent, as Shino knew Lee had unknowingly given Naru a lot to think about. So he stayed quiet to let her think. Naru was indeed thinking about what Lee had said. What could be her focus? What was she already good at? They entered the classroom again, gaining attention once more. Naru blushed slightly at all the curious stares and made her way to her seat with Shino. The boy gave her a slightly concerned look from the corners of his eyes. Naru was too deep in thought to notice. While Shino resigned himself to waiting until lunch break, which was in half an hour, to talk with Naru, the blonde was thinking hard about what she liked to do and what she was better at than her other skills. Iruka rambled about battle tactics in the background, concentrating on laying traps. Naru listened half-heartedly. She loved learning about traps usually. Naru almost smacked her head on the desk at her density. That's what she was the best at. She loved setting up pranks, and that was almost the same thing as traps, right? She could specialize in that, couldn't she? Naru grinned, and Shino noticed immediately. Shino gave her a small, unseeable smile when she beamed at him. Iruka dismissed the class for lunch, smiling when he once again saw Shino and Naru together. Naru skipped to a nearby tree, plopping down under it with her small lunch. Shino joined her at a slower pace and sat down much less suddenly. Naru chowed down on her food, content to finish eating before she told Shino about her choice. She knew he had noticed she had come to a decision. Shino, after watching the girl eat for a moment with something akin to amusement, slowly ate his own food. After both had finished, Naru scribbled a few quick lines on her paper and handed it to her friend. I think I want to concentrate on traps. What do you think? The Aburame boy looked up at her after he finished reading. He seemed contemplative, like he was truly thinking over the option. Naru appreciated this greatly. He was silent for a minute or so. I think that would be a good idea for you. You told me this morning that you liked pranks, did you not? He asked, to which Naru nodded. They had briefly talked about their hobbies while taking down the tent. However, he added, I think you also should pick another specialty. While traps can be useful on their own, it requires others' skills for it to reach its full potential. What would you suggest? I would say stealth. Stealth? Why? He was quiet for a moment, fully thinking out his answer, stealth, because it would be beneficial to setting traps, and it is also a very valuable but often overlooked ninja skill. Naru mulled it over for a minute. She supposed it was logical. And she thought with a grin, it would be pretty awesome to be able to sneak up on people. That is, if she worked hard at it. She promised herself then and there that she would train in traps and stealth and be an expert on both. Thanks Shino. His lips twitched upwards for a moment. You are welcome. They sat there for another few minutes, not saying anything. It was a companionable silence. Then, Shino broke it with a sudden question. Is it, he started, sounding slightly unsure, is it bothersome to have to write down what you say? Naru paused, then nodded with a shrug. Shino was quiet, obviously deep in thought. Naru wondered what brought on the inquiry, but figured the boy would explain himself soon enough. Would you, he started finally, would you be willing to teach me sign language then? Naru blinked at him in surprise for several moments. Then, she practically glumped him, hugging him fiercely. Shino was shocked, then hesitantly hugged her back. Naru stepped back and grinned a bright smile. Shino coughed into his fist. I suppose that is a yes, then. The blonde nodded vigorously, still beaming. She could barely believe he would go through the trouble of learning sign language just so it would be easier for them to talk. She settled down long enough to write down on her pad of paper and form a sign with her hands. This is A. Naru was on the roof of the school. Why? Well, she had just set up a trap in the class a year older than her and she wanted to watch the wonderful show before her class started. She had made sure that her trap would not affect her friend in that class, Rock Lee, because the boy had been much too nice to her to deserve being covered in itching powder. Naru, however much she liked pranking people, refused to call what she now set up pranks. It was for training. Plus, her traps were well thought out and could be modified for when she was a genin. Itching powder, for example, could easily be replaced with poison powder. So, it was not a prank, it was a trap. While Naru waited, she thought of the last 2 months. Shino had been studying diligently in sign language in addition to his regular schoolwork, though he didn't seem stressed with the extra class. He was already able to discern most of what Naru signed in a regular conversation, making Naru unbelievably happy. He still stumbled on some words, but he was only just learning anyway. Naru thought he was doing wonderful, seeing as it had taken her much longer to learn what she did, but Shino seemed determined to get up to her level as soon as possible. His thoughtfulness made the small blonde girl feel warm. To her, he was the best friend she could ask for. In the past months they had gotten closer and they spent most of their time together. Naru was jolted out of her thoughts by a few shrill screams. She looked down and across to the window of Lee's classroom. The school was roughly U-shaped, making it easy for her to watch from the opposite roof. The majority of the elder class was furiously scratching themselves, confused at the sudden downpour of white powder on their heads. The corner that Lee sat in, by the window, was completely itch-free, though no one besides Lee himself noticed. Lee swung his head around for a moment, confused as the class. Then, he grinned widely, looking out the window towards where he knew she would be hiding. He caught her eye and she winked cheekily. He grinned wider and winked back, but turned back to the front, where his teachers were also scratching themselves before he was caught. Grinning in victory, Naru hopped down from the school roof carefully. Her orange shorts and white t-shirt fluttered for a bit on the way down, exposing her stomach for a second. Once on the ground, the bubbly blonde skipped to her classroom. She slipped into her seat by Shino unnoticed by the rest of the class, a mere minute before their studies were due to begin. He took in her proud expression with amusement. I suppose it worked, then. Yes. She signed simply, not feeling much up to elaborating at that moment. She wanted to bask in her success for a few moments longer without interruption. The bug user shook his head with a chuckle. He waited until she was ready to tell him about her latest escapade, as he knew she would. He listened quietly or, rather, watched quietly, seeing as she was using sign language to her explanation of every detail of her adventure. He knew that the small details were important to her and she would not leave them out. It was just the way she was, at least when it came to her traps. Shino understood this. He was the same way when it came to his bug techniques. Just when she finished explaining her ambush to Shino, Iruka came jogging through the door, a good 10 minutes late. Sorry I'm late, he said sheepishly, I had to help out the class older than you. They had an incident with some itching powder. It was all Naru could do not to grin so wide her face broke. Even Shino smiled, though no one noticed besides Naru. Then Iruka started their day's lessons with the most boring. History. Naru still hated history with a fiery passion, and she doubted that would ever change. Naru sighed and set her head down on her arms, ruffling her chin-length, messy bob-styled hair. The haircut had been the old Hokage's idea, since her formerly long and knotted blonde locks kept getting in her way. She liked it, and Shino had even complimented her on it. He said it made her look a bit older. Naru let her thoughts drift for a moment, thinking of nothing in particular. The blonde fell into a dozing state, literally bored to sleep. She felt something that might have been a flick to her arm, then a nudge to her leg when she ignored the first. When she still ignored the whatever it was, she heard a low sigh from beside her. Bang. Naru's head jerked up at the sudden noise. She fell backwards out of her chair, mouth open in a soundless yell of surprise. The Uzumaki narrowly missed the edge of the table behind her as she fell. She lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling wondering what the heck just happened. She heard laughter from her classmates and Iruka's apology. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you so bad," he said sheepishly, scratching the back of his head. "It's time for Taijutsu practice." The rest of the students stood up and raced outside, no longer interested in Naru at the prospect of Taijutsu training. Naru grabbed Shino's hand that entered her field of vision, letting him pull her up. "Are you alright?" he asked quietly while the two followed the rest of the class. Naru rubbed the bump on the back of her head for a moment before answering with a sheepish smile. "I'm fine." Shino was quiet for a moment, watching her. Then, he nodded, coming to a stop with the other students beside the sparring section of the grounds. "Okay, we're going to do some sparring today," Mizuki started. "No weapons allowed, but any style can be used if you know another one besides academy style. No jutsu either." Iruka called up the first pair, who eagerly jumped into the ring. Naru shifted awkwardly. She was not looking forward to this. In the past 5 months Naru had made little progress on her jutsu usage. Like he promised, Shino had asked his parents about using the name of jutsus and what would happen if you didn't when first learning a technique. His father, who was a jounin, confirmed Shino's theory. Because Naru could not speak the name of the technique, it was harder than the average person for her to perform a new jutsu correctly. Of course, it wasn't impossible to perform a jutsu without saying the name when learning it for the average shinobi with average chakra capacity. Naru, on the other hand, was not the average shinobi when it came to chakra. The old Hokage had told Naru that she had about the same amount of chakra as an average jounin, with academy-level chakra control. Then he had rambled on about delving into her chakra control studies and trying her hardest to blah blah blah. Truthfully, Naru didn't care so much anymore about being able to use jutsu. Sure, it had bothered her for a very long time, but now that she had something else to concentrate on that she was already fairly good at made her less sensitive to her classmates, minus Shino, of course, jabs to her mediocre attempts at academy jutsu. Besides, didn't the majority of shinobi use jutsu of some kind? She'd just be part of the small percent that doesn't. It would surprise people. She liked the idea of sneaking around and laying traps better anyway. When Shino bumped her shoulder she realized she had zoned out again. Shino gave her an exasperated look from behind his glasses. "Sorry," she signed to him with a less than sorry grin. He snorted, amused at her antics. He had loosened up a lot since their meeting. Well, at least in her presence. He was still stiff at times when they were around a lot of people, but for the most part he didn't try to shut her out like he did the majority of the public. Once, when she asked him why that was, he only said that she was different than other people and she was his friend, not everyone else. It made her feel good when he said she was different because she knew he meant it as a compliment. Uzumaki, Naru and Iruka called, looking among the crowd for a partner who hadn't already fought. Haruno Sakura. Naru stepped into the ring timidly, while Sakura boldly took her stance, assured of her victory. Everyone knew that Naru didn't stand any chance. Naru knew she wasn't very good at Taijutsu. She was only marginally better at hand-to-hand combat than jutsu, which wasn't saying much. Shino had told her that her best bet to win these little spars was to surprise her opponent. That, and have confidence. She hadn't figured out how to do either of those yet, thus she had not won a fight so far. "Ready, weirdo?" Sakura asked. Naru took a deep breath and nodded. Then, Iruka threw down his hand in a slicing motion between them, yelling "Start." Sakura ran forward, throwing a reckless punch. Naru acted on instinct, dodging just barely. Sakura turned around and tried a leg sweep. Naru jumped over it, finally throwing a swipe back at the pink-haired girl. This continued for a few minutes until Sakura got a hit on Naru at last. Naru stumbled back, startled. After the first hit was taken, Naru lost what little confidence she had. They knew she would lose, what was the point of being further humiliated? But this time she caught Shino's eye. He was watching her from the edge, shoulders tense. He wanted her to win. Naru thought about how much he had worked to helping her these last few months. She thought about how disappointed he would surely be if she gave up. She thought about how much she wanted to make him proud to be her only friend. Naru looked up to the pinkette, a newfound determination sparkling in her blue eyes. She would not lose. She would win, for her friend. Naru darted forward, jabbing a surprised Sakura in the shoulder. Then the blonde darted away before the Haruno could retaliate. Naru wasn't completely sure what she was doing, this definitely wasn't the academy style. She shook her head and decided to just go with it. Sakura quickly got over her surprise, replacing it with anger. Haruno charged at the other girl, fist hefted. Naru then realized that Sakura really wasn't all that good at the academy-style taijutsu. Naru had given her all the power. Naru dodged Sakura's punch and gave one of her own that hit Sakura right in the stomach. Sakura fell back on her backside, glaring up at the blonde. I don't know what your problem is, dead last, Sakura started, standing up again, but you just got lucky. Sakura tried an uppercut followed by a leg sweep, both of which missed. Naru took the pink-haired girl's moment of unbalance to kick her in the stomach. Then straight out of the ring. There was a shocked silence from the surrounding crowd. Then Iruka started clapping, a happy smile on his face. Very good, Naru. Wonderfully done, he beamed proudly. Naru beamed back, glad for his approval. She was unbelievably proud of herself. She did it. She skipped back to Shino's side, ignoring the whispers from her classmates in favor of seeing her friend's reaction. She could tell he was smiling by the uplifting of his cheeks. When she came to stand beside him, he put a hand on her shoulder. Good job, he said simply, removing his hand after a moment. It was said so simply, so plainly. It didn't bother Naru at all. That's one of the things she liked most about Shino. He didn't need to add extra words to get his point across. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. Naru grinned widely at him, projecting her thankfulness without words. As the class kept casting her surprised looks, she promised herself that she wouldn't let herself be pushed around anymore. The day after what became known to Naru and Shino as Naru's taijutsu victory, Shino was shifting around nervously at lunch. Naru noticed not long after she started eating her usual lunch. She looked at him curiously, but he, surprisingly, didn't notice, apparently deep in thought. She waited a couple minutes, but when he still didn't look up, she tugged on his sleeve. Shino jumped, snapping his head up. Is something wrong? Naru signed to him, head tilted concernedly. Shino sighed, shaking his head. No, nothing is wrong. I did not mean to worry you. Then what is it? Shino adjusted his glasses, something Naru noticed he only did when he was feeling uncomfortable or nervous. Well, he started, setting down his empty bento container, you know I have told my parents about you, correct? Naru nodded. Shino had noticed very quickly how uncomfortable she was with most adults. He had been thoughtful and asked her if he could tell his parents about her before he did so, because he knew his parents had noticed a change in his temperament. Apparently, being friends with Naru had made him more inclined to speaking up to people he was comfortable with, such as his parents. Naru had agreed to letting his parents know about her, albeit somewhat reluctantly. She was very used to people not liking her, after all. But Shino had never reported back that they disapproved of the friendship. Naru took this as a good sign. Last night at dinner, he continued, I was telling them about our taijutsu practice and they were very impressed at your determination. They would like to meet you. Almost immediately Naru stiffened. They wanted to meet her. I said I would invite you to dinner tonight, Shino continued cautiously. He must have known she would react like this. Naru didn't do anything for a few moments. Shino had sensed her hesitation and hurried to reassure her. You don't have to come if you do not want to. He said, then added quietly, almost like it wasn't meant for her to hear, but it would mean a lot to me if you did. Naru was surprised. Shino barely ever said anything affectionate, preferring to let it show in his actions. You want me to come? Shino nodded, coughing into his fist in a way that was almost awkward. Naru wanted to say she would come, but what if they didn't like her? What if they were like everyone else and just threw her out of their house once they saw her? What if they forbade Shino to ever talk to her again? She didn't think she could handle that. Her worry must have been visible on her face. I am sure they like you, Naru. They would not have invited you if they didn't like you from what I have told them about you. Not many non-Aburames are allowed into our compound. Naru took a deep breath, making her decision. I'll come, she signed to him, smiling tentatively. Are you sure? He asked, you don't have to. But he already looked so relieved. She wouldn't go back on her word, no matter how nervous she already was. I'm sure. Naru stepped towards the large door, then stepped back again nervously. She checked the address that Shino had given her for what seemed like the 100th time. Building 109. This is it. She then checked her watch. 6:30 p.m. on the dot. She had to knock now if she didn't want to be late. Steeling herself, she stepped forward and knocked before she lost her nerve. She breathed a sigh of relief before realizing she didn't know what to do if anyone but Shino answered the door. Did he tell his parents that she couldn't talk? Did they know sign language? She was on the verge of having a mini panic attack when the door opened. To her immense relief, it was Shino who answered. He invited her in and led her to the dining room, where he said his mother was just setting the table. My father knows sign language, but my mother does not, so I will have to translate for you. Is that alright? He asked, looking at her from the corners of his eyes. Naru nodded and offered a nervous smile. Shino smiled back at her and placed his hand briefly on her shoulder reassuringly. As they entered the dining room, Naru was met with the sight of a very long table. Near the end, a man that she presumed to be Shino's father sat, across from a woman that she supposed was Shino's mother. Shino's father was dressed in traditional Aburame garb, much like Shino himself, as was his mother. For a moment Naru felt odd being the only one not wearing a trench coat, inwardly laughing at the mental picture it produced. "Mother, father, Naru is here," Shino introduced politely as they came to a top beside the table. The two adults looked up from where they had been quietly conversing. Shino's mother stood up from her seat, holding out a hand for Naru to shake. "Hello dear," she said kindly with a smile that was visible over her collar, "I'm so glad you could come. I am Shino's mother, but you can call me Manami." Naru instantly felt at ease, the woman was so nice. The blonde smiled back and sat in the chair Shino offered her, right beside Manami. Shino crossed the table to sit by his father, who was focused on Naru. "I am Shibi. How are you this evening?" the man asked, voice stoic. Naru, though being polite was the best way to go. "I'm fine. And you both?" she says. "I'm fine. And you both?" Shino translated for his mother's sake. "We are doing well, dear," Manami replied, still smiling, "thank you for asking." "I suppose we should eat before the food gets cold," Shibi said, gesturing to the bowls of rice, veggies and meat that Naru only noticed a moment before. Naru nodded and waited for one of the Aburames to go first. A few minutes later found her happily chewing on some wonderfully cooked chicken. They ate in relative silence, with the occasional question about the two academy student studies. Shibi, the first done eating, set down his knife and fork on his plate and turned to the young blonde. "Shino has told us you plan to specialize in stealth and trapping." It was a statement, but Naru felt the need to nod anyway. "That is an admirable plan," Manami commented, daintily placing another piece of broccoli in her mouth. "Indeed," Shibi nodded, "how do you plan to obtain that title?" "That title?" Naru's eyebrows scrunched up in confusion. "You mean the title of specialist?" Shibi nodded in response to Naru's question. Naru thought for a moment before replying. "To be honest," she started, "I don't know what I have to do to be granted the title." Shino explained what she said to Manami, adding at the end that he, too, had no idea how this was done. Shibi nodded to his son's statement, leaning back in his chair to explain. "In Konoha, titles such as Stealth and Trap Expert are given out by the Shinobi Council. One of the members can give a shinobi of their own village an objective that would classify them for their title. Now," he continued, leaning forward to look Naru in the eye, "as it is, I am a member of the Shinobi Council because I am a clan head. If you truly are serious about your goal, I can come up with an objective for you to work towards." There was silence around the table as Naru thought of his proposal. This was her chance. If he gave her a goal, she had something to work towards instead of just training blindly. "Before you say anything, know that what I would assign you would be very difficult. It would not be easy in the slightest, and you would have to work at it for years even," Shibi said seriously. Naru was not deterred by this. She knew it would take her a long time. Titles weren't given out to just anyone. "I accept." She signed simply, blue eyes shining in determination. Shibi nodded, looking somewhat impressed. He leaned back again and was silent. Naru presumed that he was thinking. Manami, taking advantage of the silence, spoke up. "Shino, dear, would you help me clear the table? I could use the help." Shino nodded, "Yes mother." Naru and the Aburame clan leader sat in silence as Shino and Manami cleared the table. Naru would have offered to help, but Shino was looking the other way and she was a bit too short to reach anything standing up. Sometimes Naru hated being so petite. After Shino and his mother had sat down again, Shibi nodded to himself. He looked straight at Naru and seemed to be evaluating her. "Very well, I have devised your challenge," he said, making the blonde feel a tad intimidated. "You will have to sneak into the Hyuga clan compound without being detected and plant some kind of trap also undetected and leave the compound without anyone knowing you were there. Something harmless is to be placed, of course." Naru's eyes widened at the proposal. The Hyuga compound was always monitored by their weird all-seeing eyes. It was the best guarded part of Konoha, besides perhaps the Hokage Tower. But Naru didn't hesitate. She would do it, whatever it took. "I will do it." Then, Shibi smiled slightly, nodding. "I will look forward to the day you do." Naru beamed back at him and decided she definitely liked Shino's parents. "Oh. My, is it that late?" Manami said suddenly, looking to the clock. It was already nearing 7:45 and it would be dark soon. "You should get going, dear. It could be dangerous to travel if it gets much later." Naru nodded at the kind woman, standing up with the rest at the table. Shibi nodded at her, saying a quick have a good evening before sweeping into another room. Manami, on the other hand, surprised a girl by giving her a hug, which Naru returned after a moment's shock. "You are welcome back here anytime, Naru. We'd be happy to have you back, even if it is only an afternoon." Minami then turned to her son. "You can invite Naru over anytime you like, alright?" Shino nodded, saying a quiet, "Thank you, mother." Then she, too, swept from the room after her husband. Shino and Naru stared at each other for a moment before Shino turned to the hall. "I'll walk you to the door." Naru nodded as she followed after him. She was relieved that his parents liked her and everything went well. They had even invited her back. Naru was still grinning when they arrived at the door and stepped out. Shino stood there awkwardly, but Naru knew he wanted to say something, so she waited. "Thank you for coming," he started quietly. "It really does mean a lot to me that you showed up." Naru grinned all the wider. Then she engulfed him in a hug, which he returned after relaxing. She stepped away a second later, knowing Shino still wasn't all that used to her impromptu hugs. "No, thank you." She signed. A young bug user smiled at his friend, stepping back into the doorway of his home. "I'll see you at school tomorrow, Naru." Naru woke up coughing. She knew instantly that she was sick. Naru would have slapped her forehead in exasperation, but it was already hurting enough by itself. Naru hated being sick. The small blonde girl didn't hate a lot of things, but being sick was one of them. She hated how icky it made her feel, she hated the way she couldn't concentrate, and most of all, she hated the way getting sick tended to ruin her plans. Naru stumbled out of her small bed to the calendar on her wall, having to stop a few times because of the seemingly spinning room. When she reached the hanging Raymond-designed calendar she leaned against the wall, checking her plans for the day. If she could speak, she would have cursed aloud. Cursing just wasn't as effective when you used sign language, at least when no one was around to see it. The day, marked in red, she had planned to put a trap, not prank in the Haruno compound. It was a test she had appointed herself in training towards her ultimate goal, the Hyuga compound. She was going to work her way up, starting with civilian homes, then to shinobi, ending with the most protected. She wanted to have at least one successful mission every 2 months. If she missed a day, which, incidentally, was the second to last day of November, she would not make her goal for this month. She could try tomorrow if she wanted to, but she knew that by the next day she'd be feeling worse. Naru sighed soundlessly, rubbing her throbbing forehead with a finger. Then, she stood up straight again, going about her morning routine without the usual bounce in her step. Showered, dressed and fed, the blonde sneezed on her way out the door. She tried to pep herself up and put her usual grin on her face. At this rate Shino was sure to notice something was up. He was way too observant for his own good sometimes. Or maybe it was for Naru's own good. Minutes later Naru collapsed in her chair at the academy, the few students that were already there ignoring the sick girl. Shino and Naru, now both 9 years old, had moved on to their second year at the academy a month ago, but it seemed as if none of the class had matured over the summer. The majority of them still called Naru the creepy girl and Shino the bug guy. Naru always frowned when they called him that. Calling the fascinating beings his clan controlled and artfully used in battle were more than bugs. Shino, however, had told her many times to ignore the mean names. Naru dozed, barely noticing the other students coming in the classroom and only sitting up when Shino sat beside her. She saw the half-concerned look he threw her from behind his dark glasses, but she ignored it in favor of setting her head back on her arms. Shino sighed and let it be for the moment. A few minutes later Iruka came in with a door slam to get the class's attention, but only served to make Naru's head pound worse. She tried not to flinch, but was unsuccessful. She once again fell into a doze, for once not even trying to pay attention to Iruka's long lecture on the importance of blah blah blah. She drifted in and out of sleep for the morning class, waking up to cough or sneeze. A few times she saw Shino watching her out of the corners of his eyes, and she knew he would not take a simple nod as an answer the next time he was able to question her. The next time she woke it was to a hand on her forehead. She creaked open her eyelids to see whose hand it was and wasn't very surprised to see Shino standing in front of her. She was, however, surprised to see the classroom empty besides the two of them and Iruka, who was standing at his desk looking between papers and the two academy students. When had they been dismissed for lunch? "You have a high fever," Shino said quietly, almost to himself, "and you're quite sick." Naru yawned and sat up, causing Shino take his hand off her burning skin. She wished he would keep it there, his skin was very cool compared to hers. "You should have stayed home from school," Naru the bug user started hesitantly. Suddenly more awake, Naru shook her blonde head fervently, but instantly regretted it when it throbbed all the more. She cupped her head in a hand, leaning on the table. Her friend removed her hand and replaced it with his own, knowing by her previous expression that the cool temperature helped. He frowned heavily down at her. "Why not stay at your apartment? What's today?" "I have to do the Haruno compound today," she signed, flopping her hands back on the desk immediately after she finished. She sighed, glad she didn't have to expand on her answer. He'd understand what she was getting at. He frowned for a few moments longer before replying, seeming to be beepizing her health. "I see. Why not do it tomorrow then? Naru, learning from her past mistake, shook her head only slightly. I'll be worse tomorrow. Not if you rest and take medicine for the rest of today. Naru looked up at him, a bit puzzled. Her colds have never gone away as fast as that before. Was medicine really that good? She hesitantly asked him her question. What she could see of his expression went from puzzled to apologetic. I'm sorry. Have you ever had medicine before? Again, she shook her head. Shino sighed, looking a bit was that sad. I see. Have you always roughed it out, so to speak? Naru nodded, watching him curiously. Shino turned his head away for a moment, adjusting his glasses, face stony. Then, he was back to normal and looking at her again. Well, I can assure you, with the aid of medicine you should be fit by tomorrow. That is, if we get you home now. Naru was inclined to just go home and stop arguing. Her head hurt like heck and her throat was terribly scratchy. But, her sensei standing in the background at his desk caught her eye. Would he let the two of them leave? Shino followed her gaze. He sighed, then nodded at her. I'll go ask, he said, practically reading her mind. She nodded and resumed resting her head on her crossed arms. Iruka looked up as soon as Shino started approaching, having been glancing at the two concernedly every few seconds. Shino talked to the kind teacher for a few moments, getting a small smile from the man and several worried looks thrown in Naru's direction. Shino then nodded and made his way back to where Naru sat, looking satisfied. We are both free to go, he said simply to Naru, who had almost fallen asleep again. Naru nodded, yawning. She sighed and stood up, but wobbled on her feet. Shino reached out a hand to steady her as she coughed, causing Naru to give him a thankful and tired look. Naru took a few shaky steps to the classroom center aisle, but couldn't quite manage it without leaning on her friend. She hated having to, but her head hurt so much, and everything was hot, and her limbs were so achy, and. This isn't going to work, Shino mumbled, Naru barely able to catch it between chest-racking coughs. They had only made it to the line of desks below theirs. The bug user thought for a moment with the smaller blonde leaning on his shoulder, trying to keep her eyes open. She knew that usually Shino wouldn't be so comfortable with such long-term close contact, but over the summer, he had become more and more used to getting hugs and other such contact Naru was prone to giving. Naru jerked when he shook her shoulder a moment later. Stay awake for a bit more, he mumbled, now standing in front of her. He turned his back to her and awkwardly wrapped her feverish arms around his shoulders. Naru wondered what he was doing. Surprisingly, what he did next was, in one graceful motion, sweep his arms to hook under her knees, making Naru full against his back, piggyback style. Naru choked in surprise, triggering a more violent cough attack. He looked back at her somewhat worriedly. Alright? He asked after her cough subsided. Naru nodded, over her shock and now feeling warm and fuzzy at his affection. Or maybe just fuzzy, she was already too warm. Shino took a few steps to test her weight. He wasn't quite sure he could carry her, but she was even lighter than he figured. Shino frowned at that. He'd have to try to get her to eat better than ramen all the time. Naru leaned her head against the back of his neck, sighing in relief at the cool temperature of his collar. Shino shifted her, but his steady breathing calmed hers and she fell into a comforting half-sleep. Shino-san, a hesitant voice broke through Naru's haze. Shino stopped walking and Naru could tell by his posture that he was a bit surprised. He turned to the left, trying not to jostle the blonde on his back too much. Naru kept her eyes closed, not caring too much to see who was talking. The small voice continued, sounding very shy. It sounded like that shy Hyuga from their class. What was her name? Yes? Shino asked, trying to prompt the girl. He really had to get Naru to sleep somewhere beside her desk or his back. The girl jumped at his voice, turning a bashful red. Is Naru-san alright? There was silence for a while as Hinata tried to control her rapid breathing. There? She had asked. Hinata smiled at her small success. She will be fine later, Shino replied. He would have been adjusting his glasses if he had a free hand, she has a bit of a cold. Oh, Hinata replied, frowning concernedly at the girl her age. Naru interrupted with a little snore. Shino snorted, shaking his head slightly as not to disturb her. Hinata smiled slightly, losing some of her blush. Shino cleared his throat, quite a bit quieter now that he knew Naru had fallen asleep. I will take my leave. She needs medicine and some sleep. Oh. Yes, I'm sorry for holding you up, Hinata replied, once again blushing a cherry red. Shino inclined his head in acknowledgement, it is no problem. We shall, hopefully, see you in class tomorrow. Hinata nodded slightly back, can you tell her I hope she gets well as soon, please? Shino stopped again from where he had started walking and nodded at the girl silently. I am sure she will appreciate it. Without any other words exchanged, Shino walked away, briefly pondering on the girl from his class that never spoke out. He brushed it off, leaving to beep eyes later, concentrating now on navigating the streets to Naru's apartment. Naru woke as she was set down on something soft. She cracked open an eyelid, wondering where the heck am I? But also recognizing the familiar surroundings immediately. I'm sorry, I tried not to wake you, her best friend said quietly from where he was standing by her bed, where she had been set down. It's okay. She signed, burrowing under her bed covers and feeling immensely glad that she had left the blinds closed this morning. Or maybe Shino had closed them. It seemed like something he would do. It was quiet for a while. Then, Naru felt his hand back on her forehead, testing the general temperature. The small girl thought she heard him sigh before the hand retreated. I don't suppose you have a thermometer? Naru shook her head, opening her eyes to give him an apologetic look. He shook his head in response to the look, waving it off. It is alright. I'll have to pick one up when I get some cold medicine, he frowned down at her, what hurts the worst? Naru frowned, thinking. My head. Shino nodded as if he expected that. But, Naru pondered, he probably did. Shino checked his watch while Naru closed her eyes again. I will be back in about 45 minutes, he looked up at her, will you be alright until I get back? Naru nodded, creaking open her eyes to sign something to him. There is money in the fridge for you to use. Shino opened his mouth to say something, but closed it when he fully registered what she said signed. What he started, bewildered, why do you keep your money in the fridge? Despite how horrible she felt, Naru couldn't help but grin at him. You wouldn't think to look there, would you? I suppose not, he replied, hiding an amused smile. I am just going to pick up a thermometer and medicine from my house. We have plenty. Naru nodded, no longer able to keep her eyes open. She yawned widely, rubbing the side of her aching head. The blonde heard him stepping away distantly, but she was already fast asleep. The next time Naru came to, it was to being given some kind of liquid. She almost spat it out once she had a chance to taste it. The Uzumaki made a face and opened her eyes, but swallowed anyway, since she knew it was the medicine Shino had talked about helping her get better. Naru coughed, sitting up to drink the glass of water Shino promptly handed her. Said boy smiled quietly at her grimace. You get used to the flavor, he said. Then, after she finished practically inhaling the glass of water, he raised a thermometer, put this under your tongue. Naru did as he said, shivering at the cold metal. The whatever it was, Naru didn't really care too much at the moment, started beeping a few seconds later, and Naru took it from under her tongue and handed it to Shino. 104, Shino stated with a frown, then looked back up at her, the best we can do for now is keep you hydrated and rested. Naru started to nod, but stopped and gave him a confused look. Shino caught it and sighed, hydrated means you need to drink a lot of water. The blonde got an look on her face and nodded, settling back into the pillows. Shino shook his head, but Naru could just barely see a smile under his collar. Naru smiled too. Shino placed a wet rag on her forehead, causing Naru to sigh in relief. Then she wondered how he had found the rag. Any reason why you keep washcloths in the oven? Naru grinned, it doesn't work anyway. How long did it take you to find them? He shook his head, not long. I looked there first. Naru gave him a curious look, wondering why the heck he had thought to look there for washcloths. You hide your money in the refrigerator, I figured everything else would be in odd places as well. Naru smiled, but ended up yawning again. Shino nodded as if he was waiting for her to do so. Back to sleep. Naru didn't even attempt to argue. She was still really tired, even with taking a 45-minute nap. Her eyes slid closed and before she fell back into slumberland, she heard the soft screech of a chair being moved closer to her bed. For the rest of the day, every time she woke Shino was there with some medicine for her to take or water to drink. One time she woke up Lee was there as well, straining to keep his voice down as she heard Shino constantly reminding him. Later Shino explained that the older boy had noticed them both leave early and had stopped by to see what was going on. The energetic boy hoped she got better soon. Shino also told her about Hinata's well wishes and expressed his confusion at her approach. Naru, too, was a bit confused but was warmed by her concern. It was just too bad Naru couldn't approach Hinata without revealing her secret. Really, Naru had only decided to tell Lee about it because he looked so sad and Shino had figured it out by himself. Naru knew how cruel some people could be because of her small disability and she didn't know how Hinata would react. Naru slept most of the day and all through the night. She woke up once when it was dark and noticed someone that was not Shino sitting in the chair by her bed. The blonde panicked for a moment as her eyes adjusted to the darkness but calmed when she realized that it was Shino's mother, Minami. Minami must have told her son to go home for the night and the kind woman must have offered to stay with her son's friend. Naru woke up when it was finally morning again feeling completely well again. Her head no longer was pounding and her throat was no longer scratchy. She had her energy back. Naru grinned as she sat up. Are you feeling better, then? She turned to see Shino back in his spot by her bed, this time with a book open in his hand. Obviously he had been reading quietly until she woke up. Naru nodded fervently to his question, glad she could do so without more throbbing in her cranium. Shino nodded back, standing up. I was hoping so, he snapped closed his book and Naru saw that it was a book on his clan techniques. I have to go get my school bag, I left it at home. The girl nodded in understanding, crawling out of her bed. Shino stood there semi-awkwardly for a moment before adjusting his glasses and turning abruptly towards the door. I will see you at school then. He took a step to the door, but Naru grabbed his sleeve before he could get far. As he turned, the shorter-than-him blonde girl quickly wrapped her arms around him in a hug. As usual, Shino stiffened in surprise before relaxing and hugging her back briefly. When she let go, he gave her a puzzled look. He opened his mouth to say something, but she beat him to it. Thank you, she signed, grinning. He was quiet for a moment. A year ago he would have asked what she was thanking him for. Now, he knew her well enough to know what she meant. Shino looked away for a second before looking back. You're welcome, he paused, but I suppose it is safe to use the expression you would do the same for me. Naru beamed at him with a dazzling smile and hurried to sign back. Of course. Naru was dropped unceremoniously on the ground by the Anbu who had caught her. He or she, Naru didn't really care to tell which, disappeared immediately after their abrupt delivery. Naru stood up and brushed herself off, feeling distinctly disgruntled. That had been the third time this month she had been caught and thrown out of a shinobi compound. What really got Naru upset with herself was that she had barely even started laying traps in ninja homes and they were catching her like she was a mere amateur. Naru huffed silently and stomped into her apartment, pacing up and down the length of it. She was most certainly not an amateur. Who was it that had laid traps in all the non-ninja compounds? That's right. Naru. Well, Naru thought, pausing in her frustrated stride, no one really knew it was her that was doing this, seeing as the Anbu only thought she was being a punk kid at the moment. Only Shino, his parents and the Hokage knew about her bi-monthly super-secret stealthy trap missions. But she was going to be found out if she kept getting caught. Naru continued her pacing, jerking a hand through her short blonde locks with a sigh. Despite finishing the civilian houses a month after her second school year ended, Naru had yet been unable to successfully sneak into even the smallest, least guarded shinobi home. It was like they always knew she was coming. It was now 3 months into Naru's third academy year and she had turned 10 just recently. With each failed mission she became more frustrated and, as a result, occasionally moody. It wouldn't bother so much if she knew what she was doing wrong. That way she could spend some time training to remedy it. But the final sigh and stomp, Naru dragged herself to her shower. After a quick rinse she tugged on her orange shorts and white t-shirt, not even taking the time to run a comb through her sopping wet hair. She was already going to be late for class at this rate and she didn't want to risk an extra long lecture from Iruka today. The blonde girl jogged out the door, hoping they'd be discussing traps or something equally as interesting today. But it was hard to be interested in even the best things when Naru couldn't help but linger on other thoughts. What was different with the shinobi compounds? What wasn't she doing right? Well, hopefully Shino would be able to cheer her up. He was always able to some way or another. At that last thought, slightly cheering in itself, Naru slipped into the year 3 classroom, trying to go unnoticed. This, however, did not work and Naru was caught almost instantly. Naru. Iruka yelled, causing most of class to cringe, late again. Naru stood there, wondering if he expected a response. Then, he seemed to return to himself, gaining a slightly sheepish smile. Just go sit down, he sighed finally, rubbing the bridge of his nose in an exasperated but slightly amused way. Naru knew that her favorite teacher had been trying to learn sign language recently, but with his teaching schedule and occasional mission assignments, he often couldn't find the time. So Shino remained her translator, but he continually insisted that he didn't mind. While most of the class had matured over the summer and the few months school had been back in, but there were still a small bunch that still called her the freaky quiet girl. Most had laid off Shino too, the whole of the class, preferring to keep their distance from the duo. As a result of this, the class still had no idea Naru couldn't talk. Shino had a hunch, however, that some of the students might be catching on. Naru wasn't sure how she felt about this, but she figured her secret would be out in the open eventually. Naru nodded to her sensei, walking promptly to her seat beside Shino. As she plopped down she could tell that the Aburame was rolling his eyes at her. Naru stuck her tongue out at him, causing his cheeks to rise slightly from behind his collar, an action Naru had long before recognized as a smile. It amazed Naru how easily Shino could cheer her up. Just his presence brightened her day. Sometimes she wondered if it was the same for him. Iruka started his long-winded lecture at the front, causing Shino to turn his attention away. Naru sighed and looked to the front as well. She perked up for a moment when she realized that the topic of choice today was, as she hoped, traps. But that excitement quickly faded as it became apparent that it was something that she had already figured out on her own ages ago. Naru sighed again and leaned her head on her palm, listening to the rapid and efficient sounds of Shino's note-taking. The Uzumaki doodled on her paper, idly sketching out a design for another trap she had in mind. Over the past year her traps had become more and more elaborate. But most of them were just sketches at the moment, seeing as she lacked most of the materials needed. Shino didn't bug her for not paying attention today. Naru grinned slightly to herself at the pun. He knew as well as she that there was very little about traps she didn't know by academy standards, that is. Of course, there was still tons for her to learn, but the basics that the class was taught wasn't enough for her anymore. By the end of the morning class, Naru's paper was filled with a diagram for a simple door jam triggered gas ambush. Naru had made sure that it could be easily practiced before she was a genin and transfigured to a more harmful level for after she graduated. As the bell rang she stuffed the paper in her pocket, making a mental note that she would most likely forget before the academy let out to check it over for improvements. Naru skipped to the tree at the edge of the schoolyard, plopping under it with her bento. Shino had recommended she start eating more than just ramen all day. Naru had whined about it for a while before eventually agreeing. But, though she'd never admit it to him, the change in nutrition did make her feel a bit healthier. Shino soon joined her at his usual pace, nodding at her lunch approvingly. Naru rolled her eyes, but dug into the mixed vegetables and rice anyway. Learn anything today? Naru sighed, setting down her utensils for only a moment. Nothing I haven't heard about from you, Shino shook his head, taking the time to chew and swallow fully before answering. Naru beamed, then frowned at him briefly, then why did you take notes? Shino paused, then answered simply. You never know when you need them. Naru grinned at his logic, rolling her eyes amusedly. Shino pointedly ignored her, turning back to his lunch. Naru, who had finished in record time, looked around the yard for something to entertain herself with. Finding nothing, she reached into her pocket and looked over her diagram, automatically worrying her lip and concentration. As far as she could tell, the gas trap would be easy to put together, with just a few adjustments here and there. But, Naru scowled, her mood souring, it wouldn't be any use if she couldn't set it up without being caught. What is it? Shino asked with slight concern. The disgruntled and unhappy expression always looked too out of place on her face for Shino's taste, and it never failed to make him somewhat worried. Naru sighed soundlessly and shrugged. Shino sighed in return and nodded understandingly. He, of course, knew all about her troubles with her infiltration, but he was as stumped as she. He would have asked his parents for advice, she knew, but Shibi was banned from giving any hints seeing as he was who gave her a goal, and Minami didn't know what was wrong either. We'll figure out something, Shino commented after a moment of silence, placing a hand on her shoulder. Naru gave him a wavering smile, recognizing his action of affection for what it was. He had gradually grown more comfortable with her impromptu hugs, but still let her initiate them, choosing to stick to his more subtle friendly pats. Naru nodded, cheering up slightly. They'd figure it out eventually. Naru skipped down the street, ignoring the scathing looks the villagers shot her. She had learned quite a while ago that it was better to ignore them completely than to react. The academy had let out nearly an hour ago, and Shino and Naru had gone their separate ways, a rare occasion in itself. Shino had a family training session this evening that he couldn't miss, and Naru, of course, understood that he couldn't just skip it. So here she was now, wandering the village by herself and wondering what to do. She supposed she could pick a random house to lay a trap in. The chances of it being a shinobi home was very small, seeing as most lived in compounds. Naru nodded to herself in conviction, already adjusting her route to take her to her apartment. She needed all the practice she could get anyway, and it had been a while since she had even the smallest successful mission. Maybe this was just what she needed. Once she arrived at her humble abode she rushed around for the things she needed. She grabbed a backpack, stuffing it with wire, tacks, nails, sealing scrolls and a few different ready-made traps. She was out the door in a flash, already grinning with excitement. It really had been too long. Naru tiptoed to the window of an unsuspecting apartment, peering inside and checking for anyone that might be home. Seeing no one, the 10-year-old ninja in training smiled mischievously, unlocking the window and slipping in with practiced ease. She dashed to check around the doorways, wincing at the sound her feet made against the floor. She really had no idea how to make herself step lighter. After a last check through of the apartment, which, Naru mused, was decorated in an awfully boring way, she dropped her backpack on the ground and started rummaging through it. Just as she was contemplating the pros and cons of a powder trap versus a paint trap she was interrupted. You'll have to be sneakier than that to keep from getting caught, a lazy, drawling voice proclaimed. Naru dropped what she was holding and whirled around, gaining a deer in the headlights look. The man, obviously a ninja, was leaning against a doorframe without a care in the world, reading an orange-colored book. He had gravity-defying silver hair and a Konoha headband stretched across one of his eyes, and a lazy air about him. Naru, still frozen, noticed his Jounin's vest almost immediately and started a mantra of "oh crap" in her head. Almost as if sensing her distress, he looked up from his book and flopped his hand at her in an uncaring gesture. Calm down, calm down. I just want to know why you're trying to prank my apartment. At this Naru thawed from her shock and glared at the man. Ignoring his slightly surprised look, she furiously started signing at him. It is not a prank. It is a trap, and it is far better than a mere prank. I do not prank people, I lay traps. And don't you forget it. She finished, putting her hand of her hips. The Jounin blinked at her for a moment, then seemed to smile, his one visible eye curving upward into a U shape. Ma, he said, raising his hands in an unarmed gesture, I get it, don't worry. Why are you putting a trap in my apartment then? Naru narrowed her eyes at him, crossing her arms over her chest. He copied her, leaning against the doorframe once more, content to wait for her response. Practice, she replied after a moment, watching him warily for his response. He blinked again and tilted his head briefly, but let it go, choosing then to survey the powder-releasing device that lay on the floor where she had dropped it. You're in the academy, aren't you? That seems to be a bit above what they teach you. Naru didn't dare look away from the man to follow his gaze, only nodding in return. It was above their level, and anyone above Genin could easily tell. Oh, he said suddenly in an aha voice, turning back to look at her, you're who's been putting traps, he modified, catching her glare, in all those civilian compounds. Naru hesitated, but not at all the same. No use denying it when he'd guessed. And this man didn't seem like he'd just attack her for the heck of it. Don't worry, he said, smiling again, your secret's safe with me. Naru hesitated again, but eventually smiled back. Thanks. She paused, unsure, who are you? Itachi Kakashi, he replied, stowing his book in his ninja pouch, and you are? Uzumaki Naru, she signed, though she had a feeling he already knew who she was and was only asking to be polite. Kakashi nodded, gazing around his apartment idly. Naru shifted uncomfortably, wondering if this was her cue to leave. Just as she was about to swoop down and stuff her supplies back into her backpack, he turned back to her, peering at her curiously. You really should work on your stealth. I could sense you from a mile away. Naru froze again, hesitating to ask her question. Sense me? Oh yes, Kakashi replied, nodding in a way she supposed he thought was sage-like, between your loud footsteps, breathing an abundance of chakra, I think any shinobi would have been able to spot you. Naru was unable to do anything for a moment, her eyes widening in realization. Then she smacked herself in the forehead, causing Kakashi to let out an amused chuckle. Of course. She had been concentrating too much on her traps that she had been neglecting her stealth. And, of course, she couldn't be a trap and stealth specialist without the stealth. Though, in her defense, she hadn't had any jounins like Kakashi to ask, seeing as the only jounin she knew was Shino's father. And she had no idea how to make her footsteps lighter or her breathing softer, or what he even meant by her chakra. Why would my chakra alert you? She asked, tilting her head in confusion. Kakashi sighed, placing a hand to his chin thoughtfully, how to explain this, even though you're an academy student, you have a lot of chakra. Now, I could tell you were here because anyone in Konoha and other villages most likely jounin level and up are trained to detect chakra and suppress their own. You see what I mean? Naru nodded, worrying her lip in thought. So, she needed to learn how to suppress her chakra, eh? How in the world? Would you show me how? Naru asked the jounin hopefully, giving her best puppy dog eyes. Kakashi chuckled, his eye curling up again into a U, of course. All you had to do is ask, Naru-chan. Naru grimaced at the nickname but let it slide. He was, after all, going to help her. Without further ado, Kakashi pushed himself away from the doorway and into the other room. Naru stood there blinking after him, wondering if she was meant to follow. But with a shrug she decided she was not and moved to start packing away her supplies. Kakashi returned in another moment, holding a tightly rolled scroll and a piece of paper he was scribbling something down on. This scroll, he said, holding up said item is instructions to suppress your chakra, and this, he waved the paper under her nose, is some tips about stepping quietly and breathing lighter. Naru tried to snatch the paper from him, but he moved it out of her reach. He shook his head, smiling, you don't get it unless you tell me why you need it. Naru scowled, but her expression cleared soon after. She supposed he had the right to know. You won't tell anyone? She asked. I promise. I want to become a trap and stealth specialist, she explained, hoping he wouldn't laugh, and Shibi gave me my assignment for it. To put a trap in the Hyuga compound. He, however, did not laugh, only nodded sagely, ah, I see. I suppose that's why all the civilian compounds have been bombarded with various traps over the last few years. Naru nodded in confirmation, smiling slightly. Ah, that had been so much fun. He mused, well, I think that's a good enough reason. Here you go. He tossed both of the items to her and she struggled to grab hold of them at the same time. He chuckled again, pulling his little orange book from his pouch. Normally I wouldn't help out some punk kid, Naru scowled at this, but I guess you have some potential. If you get stuck you can come find me, I suppose. Naru blinked, then beamed at the silver-haired man. Now, I'm already 2 hours late for a meeting, and I still have to come up with an excuse to use. So, would you please lock the window on your way out? Naru nodded hesitantly. Great. Jana. And with that he disappeared unexpectedly in a swirl of leaves. Naru blinked at the spot where he was a second ago, slightly put off by his abrupt departure. Then she shrugged. He was odd, but Naru thought he was pretty cool. Naru unrolled the scroll curiously, grinning at the contents. She couldn't wait to tell Shino. Naru skipped into class the next day, a large grin on her face. Shino smiled in response as she sat down in her customary spot next to him. Naru was practically vibrating in excitement when she nearly shoved the scroll into his hands. Sparing her a curious look he unrolled the parchment, scanning over the contents. He seemed to understand immediately what this was for and why she was so excited about it. Well, he said quietly, turning back to her with a small smile, I presume you want to get started on this after class. Naru beamed at her best friend, nodding furiously. This is gonna be great. Rules to Stealthy Living by Hot-Aki Kakashi. Rule number 1. Step lightly. This can be done by A. Distributing your weight evenly, B. Rolling your steps from heel to toe, and C. Keeping a steady rhythm. It may also be helpful to wear tighter clothing to reduce rubbing, rustling noises, and softer footwear. Rule number 2. Breathe softly. This can be done by A. Taking slow, even breaths only, and B. Breathing through your nose when possible. This should help limit the noise made. It had turned out much harder to follow Kakashi's advice than Naru originally anticipated. Stepping lightly was difficult and controlling her breathing was hard. She wished she had the money to buy tighter-fitting clothing as suggested, but she had to resign herself to wait until she saved up enough. Despite this, Naru pursued her training harder than ever, spending every minute of the last few months working on her stealth. From sitting in the academy classroom breathing as quietly as she could to walking to school with the lightest of steps, Naru was determined to permanently ingrain stealthy habits into her very being. Shino, it seemed, had taken up the position of correcting her whenever possible. At Naru's urging, of course. Whenever a loud sigh escaped her mouth or her foot slipped, Shino noticed and was quick to point it out. Naru appreciated this in his own way. He was showing his care for her training and understanding her fervor for it. You're stomping again. Naru blinked and quickly corrected herself, lightening her footfalls to the strained softness she was beginning to doubt she'd ever get used to. Naru smiled apologetically at Shino, who simply nodded in reply. They trekked in silence to the academy as Naru carefully maintained a steady walking rhythm. She fingered the worn edges of the scroll in her backpack that contained the instructions on how to suppress her chakra. They had made little progress on that part of Kakashi's advice. The technique was proving much more complex than either Naru or Shino could seem to figure out. They had planned to make another crack at it today after school. As the academy came into view, Naru halted, checking her watch. With a grin she waved Shino on without her. He rolled his eyes behind his dark glasses, sneaking in again. Naru nodded with an ever-broadening grin. Naru thoroughly enjoyed the chance to try to sneak into class every once in a while. Naru thrived on giving herself tests to show her progress, to prove it to herself. Shino simply nodded in return, having given up months ago trying to dissuade her. Naru rocked back and forth on her heels, and his footsteps receded into the academy yard and to where their classroom was. As last the bell rang and Naru started towards the academy halls, taking care not to make a sound. She could hear Iruka taking roll as she neared the door. She thought better of using the front entrance and instead hopped through the hallway window, which was already open. Naru cringed at the click-clack sound her shoes made on the hardwood floors. She really needed to get some softer ninja shoes. She was sure they existed in some shape or form. She tiptoed behind the last row of desks, very carefully dodging from chair to chair to avoid Iruka's gaze, should he look up. He was reading the class list at the moment, luckily for her. Uchiha Sasuke Urine or Yamada Manaka. Just as she made it to her row, with only the rows of kids behind her the wiser, she tripped and caught the edge of a chair with her foot. It gave off a loud screech as it scraped the floor, drawing all heads in the classroom to her. Naru. Iruka's face was already turning a reddish color. Naru's eyes glanced frantically around her, as if searching for an excuse as to what she could possibly be doing out of her seat. Explain why you are coming into class late again, would you? Iruka towered over her, seeming for all the world the most terrifying thing Naru had ever seen in her short life. The pencil innocently rolled and hit her foot. Without missing a beat, Naru snatched it up and held it up to her teacher, a sheepish smile on her face. There were a few scattered giggles throughout the class. Iruka blinked suspiciously at the item, and Naru knew he did not believe for a second that she was only getting up to grab her missing pencil. He released a gust of air in resignation. Fine, just get to your seat. Naru wasted no time in hurrying past Shikamaru and Choji to her spot beside Shino. Iruka finished roll and Mizuki began the day's lesson. Choji gave her a small grin as he munched on his potato chips, while Shikamaru looked up at her from where he rested tiredly on his arms. "Can I have my pencil back?" Naru blinked, then handed over the item with a thankful grin. He shrugged unconcernedly as he went back to napping. Did he mean to have saved her hide from the tongue lashing Iruka was sure to give? Taoji and Shikamaru, along with Hinata, were among the nicer of her class. They hardly made any contact with Shino or Naru, but every once in a while they helped her out, like today, and got her off the hook from her many late arrivals or messy traps. She was pretty sure they knew, or at least had a good hunch, that she was mute. The rest of the class still believed she chose not to talk, but were getting wiser. Shino predicted they'd figure it out soon enough. He and Naru certainly weren't going to help them out. Shino nudged her shoulder to gain her attention from where she had been staring off into space. "Close one today," he signed, "but you got farther without being caught." Shino had taken to speaking in sign language more and more lately. Naru supposed he liked the thought of talking when no one in their class could understand them. Though he didn't often make use of it in class, he instead chose to pay attention when Naru did not. "Did I?" Naru tilted her head, "That's good. Maybe I'll make it all the way next time." His cheeks rose behind his collar and he dipped his head forward slightly. "Hey, no speaking in sign language during class, you two," Iruka scolded from across the room. Naru pouted at him while Shino studiously turned back to his notes. Naru attempted to pay attention, it was something halfway interesting, the pros and cons of different weapons, but, as always, it was a losing battle. Her mind drifted to other, obviously more important, things. She carefully fished out a sketch of a new trap idea from her backpack, making like she was merely grabbing more notepaper. She worried her bottom lip as she added details and labels, meaning things only she really knew. Shino let her be for today, though Naru knew that he would pester her tomorrow to at least try to make some halfway useful notes. She used pester lightly, Shino more prodded, and then frowned at her until she agreed. The class flew by as Naru immersed herself in her planning, and by the end of class that afternoon, she had a completed design to add to the growing stacks at her house. "Mother said that part of the training ground in our compound is free today." Shino mentioned on their way out of the academy, "She said we are welcome to train there." Naru nodded, thinking of the abundance of trees and insects that made up the Aburame training grounds. It was a peaceful place to study or practice, and Naru much preferred it to the often busy training grounds around Konoha. The duo walked along in silence until the Aburame compound came into view. Naru could hear the characteristic buzzing that always seemed to occupy the whole area. She knew this was because of the bugs that were there. Naru once heard some students at the academy complaining that Shino seemed to emit buzzing sounds at times, but Naru never really noticed. Perhaps it was simply that she was used to it after all these years of spending time with him. When she asked, Shino explained that his colony did get agitated from time to time, but it would be somewhat louder when he received his full colony upon academy graduation. "Oh, Shino, there you are," called a feminine voice that both Naru and Shino knew well. "How was school, dear?" "Oh. And Naru is here as well, good." Wanami smiled down at the two as they appeared in the doorway of Shino's home. Naru grinned. She had always liked Shino's mother, she was just so kind to her. "You have been practicing your walking," Minami commented kindly. "I could hardly hear you come in, Naru." Naru beamed, signing her thanks, which Shino automatically interpreted. Minami had been picking up the basics of sign language, but still relied on Shino to do most of the translating. Naru had once asked if he minded translating for her all the time, to which he answered, "It is easier for me to translate what you say than to have people confused because they cannot understand. I do not mind." "Do you want anything to eat, dears?" Minami asked, sweeping back to the kitchen. "You are going to train today, yes?" "Yes, mother," Shino answered, following her and motioning Naru to follow behind him. "I see, good. How about some dango? I'm sure you're both hungry." "Naru is always hungry, mother," remarked Shino dryly, a smile in his voice. Minami laughed as Naru scowled at the Aburame boy, but made no move to object. She had a high metabolism, alright. She abandoned her forced quiet steps to skip to the counter, taking a seat at the breakfast bar happily. Minami set a plate of dango in front of her and Shino, which caused Naru to grin her thanks before digging in. "Have you had any progress in that chakra suppression technique, Naru?" Minami asked, peering down at the girl. Naru paused and frowned, shaking her head in the negative. Minami frowned as well, glancing at Shino. "We are going to try again today," Shino supplied, also frowning. "Perhaps we will make more progress." Minami dipped her head in a way that reminded Naru of Shino. Or maybe it was the other way around. "That's the spirit." Minami smiled at the two, "Just keep at it. From what I've read on that scroll, it is a matter of concentration." Naru and Shino nodded as they finished off their dango. Naru hopped off the stool and bowed in gratitude, gaining another smile and a "You're welcome, dear," from Shino's mother. Impatient, she grabbed Shino's wrist to pull him out to the training grounds, remembering to try to lighten her steps. He humored her and let himself be pulled, making sure to snag the training scroll on their way out. They passed some of the Aburame clan members on their way to the grounds. Both received polite nods in recognition, all to which Naru returned with a delighted grin. It was only in the Aburame compound that she received so much positive or at least neutral attention. It was an odd, but not unpleasant, sensation. The two settled in a grassy field in the midst of trees. Shino unrolled the scroll and started to read it, but Naru didn't have to. She had memorized it by now. How many times had she stayed up late reading it, frustrated by her lack of progress? "I suppose we could try starting with meditation," Shino said at last, taking a seat in the grass. Naru followed, sitting across from him. "We have already figured out this is less of a jutsu and more of an active skill, one of concentration," as mother said. Naru nodded, then hesitated a moment before signing, "I'm not very good at concentrating. Do you think I'll ever be able to get it?" Shino frowned at her wilting form for a second, then spoke with a quiet conviction, "Of course you will." He said nothing more, but it was enough for Naru's spirits to be revived. Shino's quiet confidence in her meant much more than any loud false praise would from anyone else. She smiled at him and he nodded. "Close your eyes and try to focus on your inner workings, find where your chakra is." Naru nodded and did as he said. She struggled a few minutes with the sounds and sensations around her that were heightened once her eyes were closed. The wind blowing through her hair and the strange buzzing sound distracted her for a few moments, then Shino's even, quiet breathing caught her attention. Then she was focused on her own breathing, which she noted with pleasure was a bit softer and quieter than Shino's. This was usually the farthest Naru would make it into meditation. After what felt like half an hour had passed, this was still so. Then she felt a tingle in her chest, and the blackness behind her eyelids began to shift. It felt as if she were falling for a moment as she drifted farther back into her mind. A network of tubing appeared all over her body. Vibrant blue chakra ran throughout and pulsed with her blood. The network surrounding her throat and voice box was damaged and scarred, making Naru frown. But she did not let herself linger there, instead searching on. When she reached her stomach, she noticed a swirling pattern there. "What is?" She prodded the place with her mind. In an instant, white-hot fire overwhelmed her senses, and she jerked back from the place. The fire retreated back into the swirl and settled there. Naru crinkled her eyebrows, wondering just what in the world it was. She pushed away the thoughts of the strange symbols and red-hot substance in favor of examining her chakra more. The blue chakra seemed to radiate from the tubing, her chakra ducts, in an almost blinding way. Naru could now see what Kakashi meant about being able to sense her from a mile away. Naru thought for a moment, then concentrated on pushing that radiating chakra back into the ducts. It was tough to do, especially since she didn't really know what she was doing. It felt like she was trying to push back water into a broken cup with only a finger for help. After a long while of struggling, Naru could feel her chakra recede slightly. The network no longer glowed outside the ducts, and all the chakra was encased inside. Naru breathed a mental sigh and committed the feeling to memory. Then, just as she lost her concentration, the dam of chakra broke again and rushed back out. Her eyes snapped open, and she came face to face with Shino. He had a hand on her shoulder and was watching her intently. Naru was dazed for a moment, then grinned dazzlingly at her friend. "I got it. I really got it that time. I mean, I'll have to keep practicing to be able to hold it for any amount of time, but I got it." Naru stood as she signed this frantically to Shino, beaming in excitement. He stood as well, watching her sign avidly. He smiled at the end of her rant, replacing his hand on her shoulder. "Wonderful." Naru beamed all the wider, tackling Shino with a brief hug. Once they resumed upright position, Shino pushed up his glasses with a finger and said, "Now that you know the feeling, try without having to meditate." 1 week before Genin exams. Naru ducked behind a bush quietly, holding her breath as she strained her ears to hear footsteps. The Genin exam was next week. Shino and Naru had been practicing and training like maniacs, well, Naru more so a maniac. Shino was just as calm as ever, in preparation for the test. Shino was pretty well prepared on academy curriculum, but Naru was worried for her knowledge. Sure, she knew the basics of the written work, by force of Shino, and she'd been doing much better into jutsu, but if there were any jutsu on the test she was done for. She didn't voice this to Shino, however. There was nothing either of them could do about it, so what use was it worrying him as well? "Found you." Naru jumped and whirled around, pouting. Shino stood with his arms crossed, staring down at her hiding spot. "But it took you a while to find me this time." Naru signed back. Shino inclined his head, his cheeks lifting slightly. But the introduction of Shino's newest bug technique, sensing chakra, the two's favorite training method for the both of them, was born. Naru would hide, using all of her ever-growing stealth skills and chakra suppression to be undetected. In turn, Shino would have to try to find her, using his bugs and having to strain his own senses. This worked well and let both of them train at the same time. With practice, suppressing her own chakra had become easier and easier for Naru. Now, she could go undetected chakra-wise for up to 2 hours. However, the moment her concentration slipped, she was back on the map. Naru stood and waltzed back to the center of the field, taking delight in how her feet made barely a sound on the grass. She plopped down on the ground and stared up at the clouds. The rustling from beside her told her Shino had joined her. They lay in silence for a few minutes, enjoying the breezy day in quiet companionship. Then Naru frowned to herself and hesitated before signing Shino, "Do you think both of us will pass next week?" She did not have to look over at him to know he had seen her movements. He said nothing for a few minutes, and Naru began to doubt he was going to answer. Then he responded quietly, assuredly. "I have no doubt, Naru." Naru took a deep calming breath as she sat in the classroom next to Shino. Her breathing stayed even for a few moments before she resumed her hyperventilating. Shino sighed from beside her, but Naru didn't turn to look at him, so consumed in her panic she was. Questions with answers she didn't have whirled in her head. What was the test going to be like? Would she pass? Would Shino pass? Would anyone pass? What if the test was made to be so hard just to fail her whole class? But, what if she did pass? What then? She'd be a genin. What would that be like? How would she? Naru tapped her fingers on the desk in the dead silence of the classroom. There was no idle chatter today, for almost everyone was silent with nerves. The genin exam. At long last. All her years at the academy had been leading up to this day. Today she would either make genin and become a full-fledged ninja or be left behind for another year at the academy. Shino's hand on top of her stopped her incessant tapping. Naru gave him a glance to see him looking at her out of the corners of his eyes. He released her hand and she kept it still. "What am I going to do, Shino? What if she started to sign, but Shino cut her off with his own signs. "You will do fine." He signed, "I know so." Naru's hands dropped into her lap as she nodded hesitantly. His quiet confidence in her was reassuring, but her own uncertainty in her skills was becoming overpowering. He frowned at her as if he knew what she was thinking, and she guessed he most likely did, but said nothing more as Iruka and Mizuki came into the room. Iruka stared around at his painfully silent class of students in worry and tried to offer a small smile. Mizuki placed down a large stack of papers and stood beside Iruka at the front of the class. "You will now be taking the written portion of your graduation exam. You will not be permitted to." Mizuki went straight to business, stating the rules and regulations with strict fluency. Naru sat up straighter in her seat and gnawed a bit in the eraser of her pencil as the tests were passed out. Shino got in a last squeeze to her shoulder in reassurance before the test began. Naru's mind felt like mush as she worked through the questions. She was forced to guess on most all of the history questions and only really felt confident in the questions related to traps or stealth, which were few. An hour ticked by on the clock with agonizing slowness. By the time she was finished, she felt she had gotten, at most, a 60% grade. However, she felt a huge relief that at least one portion of the exam was over. Without so much as an explanation, they were whisked outside for the Taijutsu section. It was quick, a half hour at most. This Naru did much better at and was confident she did well for her grade. Shino, too, did very well and smiled back at the happy beam Naru gave. They were ushered back inside to their seats. Iruka stood forward and smiled at the now more uplifted students. "For the final portion of the exam we will call you by name and you will perform a jutsu demonstration." The grin slipped off Naru's face as her stomach dropped through the floor. She gripped her chair in a death grip, all her worst fears for the exam being realized. What was she going to do? There was no way she could do any of the academy jutsu. How in the world? Shino pried her hand from the chair and held it tightly, drawing her attention to him. "Naru, calm down," he murmured urgently, worry written in every inch of his face visible. "Stay calm and you will do fine. Breathe." Naru sucked in a deep breath to try and do what he asked. But overwhelming panic was consuming her and the what-ifs clouded her thoughts. "Breathe Naru, breathe. Aburame Shino." He looked up to the front, where Iruka was looking at them both in sympathy. He squeezed her hand as he reluctantly stood. "Remember, breathe and stay calm, Naru," he said as he was forced to depart. Naru nodded and tried a forced grin, but she knew he wouldn't be fooled. And then he was gone, behind the door to take his own test. He did not return as the next person was called in and Naru regained her death grip on the chair. Chaogi gave her a pat on the shoulder and a genuine smile as he passed. She tried her best to return his kindness. The numbers dwindled over what felt like hours, but the clock only showed as a half hour. Naru focused all her attention on doing what Shino had directed, but couldn't shake the terrible foreboding feeling. Uzumaki Naru. Her breath hitched and she stood to meet Iruka. He gave her an encouraging smile, but she could see in his eyes his worry. She stepped through the door and winced as it shut behind her. Mizuki had no sympathy in his eyes as he stood before her with a clipboard. "Alright, Naru," Iruka started kindly, his own clipboard in his hands, "preform the Henge no Jutsu." Naru closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Keep calm and breathe." Her hands formed the signs for the jutsu, much different than the signs she used to talk. She screamed the name of the jutsu as loud as she could in her mind, willing that it would work. There was a second of pause, then the familiar burning from her chakra started up in her hands. She held the chakra flow for as long as she could, hoping against hope it would work, but was forced to release the jutsu after only a few moments. Iruka smiled sadly as he marked on the clipboard. Naru dropped her hands to her sides in resignation, waiting for the next command. "The bunshin now, Naru." The weight of failure already pressing down upon her, she did the necessary hand motions. But this turned out even worse than the one before and left her hands with a residual stinging. Iruka sighed and Naru could hardly bring herself to look at him. The rows and rows of Konoha village headbands gleamed mockingly at her from behind him. "I am sorry, Naru," Iruka murmured with a frown, "but I can't pass you." Naru bit her lip and nodded jerkily. He reached forward to touch her shoulder, but she moved away. She bowed and ducked out of the back door before he could say any more. Failed. She had failed. She passed by windows leading to the academy yard, feeling as if the whole world were on her shoulders. What use was all her training if she couldn't even become a genin? She was a dead last when all her class were moving on. She looked out the window and froze at what she saw. Shino was standing in the academy yard, waiting for her. The metal-plated band around his head reflected the sun, proclaiming his new status. She had failed Shino. He believed in her, was so sure in her abilities, and she had failed. He would be forced to move on without her. He would have to leave her. It was with that when it all came crashing down on her. All the lonely days before him ran through her head and the promise of returning to that was too much. How would she be inspired to better herself without him to pester her to study or help in her training? Who would she bother and make comments on bug techniques with? Who would be her one and only best friend? Tears stung her eyes and dripped down her whiskered cheeks. She turned away from the door leading outside and hopped out the window leading the other direction. She couldn't face him, not now, and see the disappointment on his face. Naru wasn't really sure where she was, but in the forest of Konoha somewhere. It had been at least an hour since the exam's conclusion, so Shino surely had noticed her absence by now. A sob rose up in her throat as tears slid silently down her face. She cursed her silent mouth, wishing she could talk. But no words would ever escape her mouth again. She could hardly remember the feel of talking, it had been so long. The hand landed on her shoulder and she jumped up. She whirled around, expecting Shino. But it was not the Aburame boy. Instead, it was Mizuki. Naru scrubbed the tears from her cheeks and glared at her least favorite teacher. He must know what pain she was in, why could he leave her alone? "Naru," he said breathlessly, "I'm glad I found you." She raised her eyebrows and tilted her head in confusion. Never, in all her years at the academy, had Mizuki shown any interest in her. He plowed on without taking much notice of her expression. "We just got word from the Hokage, we have another test for you to take, so you might be able to pass." Naru snapped to attention. Another test. A second chance. It almost seemed too good to be true, but she nodded frantically at him. He smiled, an odd side on his face. "Now, it is a bit difficult, so I don't know if you can do it, but you have to do some sneaking around." Naru grinned in excitement, putting aside the strangeness of the situation. This was her chance. "There is a scroll," he explained, "in the Hokage tower that is kept under tight lock. Your job is to take it to training ground 17 and learn something from it without anyone knowing. Can you do that?" Naru's smile dimmed a bit. She reached down into the sand to write. "I have to steal it." But Mizuki only smiled, "Yes. But it is all cleared with the Hokage, don't worry." Despite his reassurances, Naru couldn't help but feel the wrongness of his words. She chewed on her lip for a moment, battling with herself. "I'm sure your friend, that Aburame boy, would want you to be able to pass with him if you had the chance." But these words Naru pushed away her doubts and gained a firm resolve. He was right. This was her only chance to be a genin with Shino. And if this is what she had to do, then she would do it for Shino. Her feet felt light as air as she tiptoed into the Hokage tower. She had a very tight lid on her chakra as she dodged around corners and rushed down hallways silently. All of her stealth training thus far went to work as she strained to do her very best. She would not fail this time. It was more simple than she expected to snatch the desired scroll and make a break for the training grounds. Perhaps Mizuki wasn't expecting her to have trained for so long in hard and stealth. Training ground 17 was hidden deep in Konoha's forests. A chill ran down Naru's back as she stepped into the dark grounds alone. The sun had set only a half hour ago, and the last dregs of sunlight were dwindling away. With a sigh, she sat on the ground and unrolled a large scroll, eager to get to work with one of the things inside. But her grin melted away as she began to read. Jutsus. All jutsus. She bit her lip but forced away her doubt. She was doing this for herself and Shino. She closed her eyes and pointed at a random name. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. With a heavy heart, she stood and began her first attempt. Naru dropped to her knees, her hands on fire. This had passed any pain she had felt before, but still she pushed on. Her hands were cherry red and were starting to peel and crack from the chakra burns. Even her arms were starting to be affected. Tendrils of burns ran up where she knew her chakra ducts were up to about her elbow. It was a gruesome sight, so Naru avoided looking at it. She hauled herself up off her knees, grimacing as she used her hand to push up off of. It was completely dark now. She had been at it for close to an hour and a half now. She wondered briefly if Mizuki was going to come find her, or she had to go to him when she was finished. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. A soundless cry escaped her lips as the familiar burning passed through her limbs and settled in her fingertips. The skin on her fingers split and a few drops of blood slipped out. Naru watched in a daze as the wound closed up again and stopped bleeding, but the burns didn't go away. How strange. There you are. Naru snapped her head up to see Mizuki burst through the trees, looking very out of breath. He no longer looked as kind and understanding as he did a few hours ago, but was glaring at her fiercely. Naru opened her mouth in surprise. Give me the scroll, you brat. Where is it? He questioned, taking a step closer. Stricken, Naru took a few stumbling steps away, suddenly frightened by his demeanor. What? She mouthed to him, her damaged hands shaking. He only looked more angry, advancing on her. Naru was confused. Hadn't he told her to take the scroll? What was going on? You are an idiot, aren't you? He gave a glance over his shoulder urgently. Do I have to spell it out for you? I tricked you, you dumb demon. Demon? The conflicting images of her instructor became one as Naru quickly tried to deduce what was going on. He had taken her for a fool and used her for his own uses. And she had been a fool, so caught up in her sadness about the exam that she listened to every word he said, never mind how indifferent he had been to her all her years at the academy. Her foot struck the scroll as she backpedaled. Both their eyes zeroed in on it. There was a second of silence before a jumble of motion happened at once. Naru swooped down to snatch the scroll, just as Mizuki made a dive for it. Naru stumbled back from him and took to the trees, ignoring her aching hands and arms as adrenaline began to pump through her system. A volley of throwing knives dug into the tree she ducked behind. She breathed heavily as she moved, hysteria and stress about the situation frazzling her nerves. He was going to kill her for this scroll. Come out, Uzumaki. He called, just give me the scroll. Naru scowled at his demeaning tone. At once she remembered herself. She was a stealth and trap specialist in training, darn it. It was time to disappear. At once, Naru put herself into her very best stealth mode. Her breathing quieted and her footsteps softened. The lid on her chakra was tightened and Naru hid. She could hear his confused grunt as he slowed to a walk. He sounded a muffled curse as he stopped behind her hiding spot. Where did she go? He mumbled to himself. Naru smirked slightly, watching a bug crawl on her burnt arm, then fly away. Come out, Naru, there's no time for games. If only that dart to your throat all those years ago had killed you, then I wouldn't be in this mess. Mizuki scoffed miserably to himself. A smirk slid off her face at his words. She sucked in a deep breath of surprise as she put a hand to her throat and Mizuki's head shot in her direction. Naru barreled out of her spot but was not fast enough to escape. He snatched her arm and held it in a death grip. Found you. Naru struggled, but he only held on tighter. The wounds on her arm stung at his grip, cracking and starting to bleed. But, like before, the cuts closed up, leaving only the burns behind. Unnatural creature, Mizuki said in disgust, taking the scroll from her hands. Funny how a demon can only keep you from bleeding. Naru stared up at him, willing answers to come from his lips. Why did he keep calling her a demon? How did he know about? He snorted, your face is too expressive for a ninja. But I suppose that makes up for your mute mouth. Naru glared at him, baring her teeth fierily. She saw a flash of fear in his eyes before he brought a kunai to her throat. Naru heard a faint buzzing sound in the distance. Behave, QB. You may have been able to save yourself from death so many years ago, but my master will not tolerate failure again. He raised the kunai and Naru panicked, pushing him a step backward. He dropped her arm and the kunai like they were on fire, feeling an electric shock run through his body. Naru darted away as Mizuki looked down at the electric trap he had stepped on. When did you? Enough. Both Naru and Mizuki whirled around to meet the new voice. Naru grinned in relief at the sight of the Aburame head and her best friend's father. Shibi wasted no time in sending out a horde of bugs onto Mizuki, making quick work of sucking out his chakra. He only had time to let out one yell before he collapsed to the ground in a dead faint. Naru, too, collapsed, all adrenaline out of her system and leaving behind a tired, hurt, confused girl. But she did not fall far before Shibi caught her. He gazed down at her from behind his dark glasses as her eyelids drooped tiredly. He took in the sight of her abused arms and hands and the scroll lying next to Mizuki with a stoic expression. "Shino has been very distressed," he said simply as he started to carry her away, trusting an Anbu officer to pick up Mizuki shortly. He wasn't going anywhere soon, regardless. "I assume we will be meeting him along presently." Naru gave a nod, trying to sign her thanks before giving up at the sharp pricks it caused. Blood dripped from her fingers for only a moment before sealing again. Was that what Mizuki meant? He called her a demon, the QB, multiple times. But the QB was a fire demon, the Nine Tails. It was dead, according to what Shino had explained. Was she some sort of reincarnate? "Do not trouble yourself on his words, Naru," Shibi said, examining her expression. "I have heard much of your conversation through my insects. I will explain once we find Shino and you receive treatment." Naru blinked, but nodded. They walked in silence for a few moments back to the village. The trees were starting to thin, and Naru could catch a glimpse of Konoha through the branches. "Your trap was very well executed," Shibi commented suddenly. "I see you have improved much on your stealth as well." Naru beamed at the compliment, nodding her thanks. "Father." Shino dropped down in front of them both as they stepped into the village gates. He opened his mouth to say more, but stopped short at the sight of Naru being carried by his father. Naru shifted nervously as the young Aburame's eyes trailed over her arms and hands, taking in the abuse in a shocked silence. "Naru has been through a great ordeal, Shino," Shibi's deep voice intoned. "All will be explained once Naru is healed. I am sure she has as much to say to you as you do to her." Shino nodded once, but the stiff posture of his shoulders did not relax. Naru offered a feeble smile, but Shino did not return it. The smile dropped and she sighed. They trekked in silence to what Naru assumed would be the Aburame compound. The hospital refused to admit her, for reasons unknown to her. Well, if she really was a demon, she couldn't blame them. Naru must have started to doze as they walk, for she awoke to the sound of a door slamming open and a loud familiar voice. "Shibi, Shino," called Minami, "did you, oh, dear. Some chakra ointment and bandages, if you would, Minami." Minami cast one concerned look at the trio before rushing back inside to get supplies. Shibi led the two children to the living room where he set Naru down on a couch gently. Shino did not hesitate before hopping up beside her, stiff and at attention. Naru wished she could use her hand so she could talk to Shino. He had not said a word since he had found them, and it was concerning Naru. Despite how well she knew him, Naru could not see past his emotionless and silent wall this time. Minami rushed back into the room and immediately started to tend to Naru's wounds. "Oh, dear, how in the world did you get these?" "I am sure we will have much to talk about once Naru regains use of her hands." Minami nodded, worrying her bottom lip in concern. Naru gave her a fleeting smile as she applied some thick ointment. There was almost instant relief, causing Naru to sigh and sink more into the couch. After the ointment, Minami wound some bandages over her arms, from fingertip to just above the elbow. Naru gingerly tried to flex her fingers and only experienced a fraction of the pain from before. "Now," Shibi said as Minami and he took a seat on the opposite couch as Shino and Naru, "perhaps it is time to tell your story, child." Naru nodded and began from the beginning. She didn't dare look at Shino as she told of running away from the academy instead of going to meet her friend. She felt him shifting for a moment beside her, but he did not say a word. She then rushed to tell about meeting Mizuki and his task given. The infiltration into the Hokage Tower was skimmed over quickly in her shame. Then she told of the next few hours of torturous trial and retrial of the jutsu that burned her arms with every attempt and the chase when Mizuki found her. Minami dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief at the conclusion of the story. Shibi and Shino sat in stoic silence, but the air was thick with emotion. "I see," Shibi said at last, "there is much you must be told, then." "Why did he keep calling me the QB?" Naru signed, "Am I really?" "No, child," the Aburame head said firmly, leaving no room for argument, "you have merely been host to the QB no Kitsune." "But the QB is dead," Shino spoke up for the first time. Naru whipped her head around to look at him. He was staring at his father with his eyebrows scrunched, trying to piece together the puzzle. He gave a glance to her, and his expression relaxed a tad. After a moment he offered a tentative smile, which Naru returned with a relieved grin. "According to our history, that is correct," Shibi affirmed. "However, the truth is that instead of killing the beast, the fourth Hokage imprisoned it into a child born on that very same day." Naru gasped silently. It made sense now how her birthday was on the same day as the QB festival and how harshly the villagers tended to treat her sometimes. Doesn't that mean the same thing, though? Naru questioned with a frown, if it's inside me. Shibi looked at her thoughtfully as Shino rushed to speak. You are not a demon, Naru. Naru smiled at her friend but awaited on Shibi's response. She had to be sure. Answer me this, Shibi began after a moment, since we Aburame house a colony of bugs, are we ourselves insects? Do we become one and the same? Naru shook her head at once, no, you are separate. Shibi nodded in approval, then you have your answer. Naru nodded with a large smile. As if Minami could handle no more, she rushed forward to gather Naru in a hug. Oh, you are handling all this so well. Naru carefully squeezed her friend's mother back before she let go, her hands beginning to ache again from use. Minami dabbed her eyes once more as she resumed her seat. But wait, Shino added with a tinge of uncertainty in his voice, what did Mizuki mean, the QB saved her from death so many years ago? The smile slipped off Naru's face faster than it had appeared. She froze, feeling both Shibi and Minami look in her direction. That, I am afraid, is not something I can tell you, Shibi replied, looking sternly at his son, it is Naru's story to tell if she so wishes. Shino hesitated, but nodded, looking to Naru. Naru did not turn to look at him, but down at her lap. There was a moment of silence before Shibi stood. I must go report to the Hokage about tonight's events. I should be back soon. Minami nodded, standing to walk him to the door. The two adults turned to leave the room. Minami turned back in the doorway at the last second, addressing her son. Shino, show Naru to a guest room. She will stay here tonight. Shino nodded, standing to lead Naru down the hall. The girl followed him in silence, looking down at her interlocked hands. Now that it was only the two of them, the air seemed heavy and tense. Shino opened a door and stepped inside, revealing a simple but cozy guest room. He stopped with his back to her in the middle of the room. After a second of no movement from the boy, Naru stepped closer and put a hesitant hand on his shoulder. At her touch he whirled around and wrapped his arms around her shoulders in a tight hug. Naru stood stiff for a moment in shock, but quickly relaxed and returned the embrace. Shino had never before initiated a hug between the two. Do not worry me so again, he mumbled into her shoulder before pulling away. I'm sorry. Shino shook his head with a sigh. He went to sit on the bed, Naru taking up the seat beside him. I wish you had not run away when you found out you had not passed the test. I would not have abandoned you. I know, Naru sighed shamefully, I was just afraid. I know. He said, do not feel badly for the events tonight. Mizuki took advantage of you. Naru nodded, flexing her fingers. The bandage at the top of her arm became loose and started to unravel a bit. Shino took notice and wordlessly wound it back into place and secured it. Shino, Naru started, watching him tie off her bandage, I want to tell you about what Mizuki was referring to. Shino looked up at her quickly, examining her expression. After a moment he nodded, frowning slightly. Naru took in a deep breath, looking away from his face to stare at the opposite wall as she sighed. When I was very young, only 4 or so, I had gone out on my own around the village. I had been alone as long as I could remember, so it was normal for me to do so. However, I had forgotten what day it was. The QB festival, my birthday. I had wandered off too far. I was brushing the edges of the walls, walking along by myself. I remember singing to myself. And then, I felt something hit me in the throat and I couldn't breathe anymore. I pulled out a poison dart and fell to the ground, screaming in my mind for someone to find me. They didn't for a while, I understand. Now I know the only reason I survived is because of the QB. But at the cost of my voice. Gigi says my voice box healed incorrectly, making it unable to use. They can't fix it. Naru felt the tears roll down her cheeks. A hiccup built in her throat as she thought of the last time she used her voice. Singing. She had been singing. Shino placed a hand on her shoulder, warm and comforting. I am sorry, Naru. I am so sorry. Naru smiled up at him, scrubbing the tears from her cheeks. It's okay. I'm okay. Shino stared at her silently before nodding slowly. He opened his mouth to say more, but was interrupted by a knock on the doorframe, drawing their attention to the open door. Shibi stood there calmly, back from his meeting with the Hokage. Naru saw a flash of silver before he tossed something to her. Automatically, she caught it, staring with wonder and confusion at the object in her hands. The Konoha leaf engraved headband, just like the one Shino wore. Naru looked to Shibi in confusion. The Hokage and I both agreed that your actions tonight thoroughly merited your graduation to Genin status. Congratulations. A slow grin creeped up on Naru's face, overtaking it in a matter of seconds. If she could speak, she would be squealing loudly. She turned to Shino, seeing his own smile and glomped him in a hug. There was a smile in Shibi's voice as he spoke, your team assignments will be the day after next. Get some rest, the both of you, for we have much to accomplish tomorrow. Shino pushed Naru off of him with a smile, nodding to his father. Shibi exited as Shino stood, leaving Naru pouting on the bed. "Sleep now, Naru," Shino admonished with a quiet laugh, "we can celebrate more in the morning." Naru nodded as she felt lethargy slip over her at the thought of sleep. Her eyelids drooped as the weight of the day settled on her. Shino said nothing more as he saw her start to wilt into sleep. Quietly, he flicked off the light and closed the door behind himself as he left, a smile on his lips. Naru blinked in the darkness, feeling so happy and safe, despite the danger she had been in hours before. She relaxed into the pillows of the bed, slipping effortlessly into dreamland. Naru awoke the next day to the lazy afternoon sunshine streaming through the curtained windows. She yawned a jaw-cracking deep breath and smiled to herself. Her fingers twitched underneath the thick padding of bandages, but she paid them little kind. Her gaze caught the shining silver leaf plaque and headband, and her grin widened. A genin at last against all odds, she was finally a genin. The door to the bedroom creaked open slowly, and Minami poked her head in. "Oh. You're awake." She opened the door wider. Naru grinned at her and winked, jumping from the bed. Minami laughed at her silliness and stepping in the room. In her hand she was holding a plain paper bag. "Shino and I were getting worried when you slept well through the day, but I suppose you needed your rest after what you went through last night." Naru nodded her head, looking out the window to the mid-afternoon sun perched in the sky. She turned back to Minami, tilting her head curiously and hoping she got the message she was trying to convey to the woman. Minami wrinkled her brows in contemplation for a moment but snapped her fingers as comprehension cleared her expression. "Oh. You're wondering where Shino is?" Naru nodded, flexing her bandaged fingers and frowning at the dull stinging sensation that still resided there. Minami continued, "He is out with his father for a bit running an errand. I finally convinced him to go. I have never seen that boy so stubborn." Minami smiled, giving Naru a fond look, "Though I suppose it's becoming more common when it concerns you, Naru blushed a bit, but grinned. She shrugged, but couldn't deny that lately Shino had been developing a stubbornness streak when concerning her. All logical to him, of course. "Well, anyway, I have a gift for you, young lady," Minami exclaimed, coming closer to sit on the side of the bed. She clutched a brown bag closer to her chest, watching in amusement as Naru perked up and looked ready to pounce on the bag. "Shino has mentioned that you have been very anxious to get some proper ninja clothing that would fit your stealth needs better. Well, I took it upon myself to get you some better clothes to use. It's not much, but it should last you for a WH." Naru could take the suspense no longer and really did pounce on the bag, but calmed enough to gently take the items of clothing out of it. Inside there was a sea of muted browns and splashes of pale lavender. Not nearly as bright as the orange dress she currently wore, but that was kind of the point. There were 3 pairs of soft but tight-fitting dark brown pants and another 3 equally tight and soft lavender shirts. There was one brown vest filled with a multitude of pockets and pouches that she could hold all her traps and supplies in. At the bottom of the bag was a pair of ninja sandals. However, upon closer inspection, they were not quite ordinary sandals. Along with being more boot-like in design, they were incredibly smooth and soft on the bottoms. As Naru put them on, they made no click-clack noise like her other pair often did. Naru beamed up at Minami. "It's perfect," she mouthed out to her. Minami's indulging smile grew and she laughed cheerfully. "Well, go on. I want to see the whole thing on." Without giving much thought to modesty, after all, it was only Minami there, she changed out of her old neon dress and into the proper ninja garb she was gifted with. She beamed at herself in the mirror. Minami came up behind her, beaming as well. "Oh, Naru, look at you." Minami suddenly sniffed. Naru looked up at her in alarm, her eyes widening. Minami laughed again, waving a hand in the girl's direction. "Don't mind me, I'm just very proud of you." Naru's heart swelled and she grinned all the wider. She spun around and clasped her hands around the taller woman in a crushing hug, trying to convey all her thanks. She was sure Minami got the idea by the way she squeezed tenderly back. "Don't forget to put this on as well," Minami said after their brief embrace, "you earned it, after all." She passed the Konoha headband to Naru, who once again stared down at it in awe. Then she looped it around her neck, tying it in a firm knot so it wouldn't make noise as she walked. "Well, now, gifts aside." Naru gave a silent gasp, thunking herself on the forehead with the palm of her bandaged hand. Minami blinked and opened her mouth to question, but Naru dove for the pad of paper and pen on the nightstand to scribble furiously and a bit painfully due to her damaged hands. "I forgot Shino's graduation present at my house. I have to run and go get it before he gets back." "But Naru, wait, I have to check your bandages before you." But Naru had already sped past her, completely silent in her new clothing. Minami raised a hand to stop her, but sighed and smiled as the slam of the front door sounded in response to her objections. "That silly girl." Naru sprinted down the road to her home, marveling at the way her new clothes made being silent that much easier. Or perhaps it had some to do with the leaps and bounds she had been making in her training, with the help of Shino. She settled into a comfortable pace, still trying to subconsciously keep quiet and buckle down on her chakra. She allowed her mind to wander for just a moment, straying to thoughts of a certain fire fox demon. Naru frowned, pondering the QB and all she had learned the night before. It was strange that she had been housing such a beast and had no idea of it. Well, not quite no idea of it. Suddenly the fiery chakra she had found in her meditation made more sense, now that she knew where it came from. And her spontaneous healing powers were also put into a little bit more perspective. But she pondered, why doesn't it work on these dumb chakra burns? The blonde looked down at her sore hands, wincing at the thought of the burns underneath them. She'd have to figure it out later. She hopped into the window of her home, neglecting to use the booby trap rig door. Not to say the window wasn't protected, it's just the window traps were easier to reset. She skipped around the apartment, collecting various things she would need for the next day. If she knew Shino and Minami as well as she thought she did, they would both insist she stay at the Aburame's another night. So, she gathered her things and made sure to pick up her special graduation gift for Shino. She hoped he liked it, though she was fairly sure he would. It was a practical gift, just Shino's style. Necessities collected, Naru swooped back out the window and reset her traps with a few flicks of her wrists and pokes in all the right spots. Those look fancy. Naru jumped and spun around, glaring up at the tall silver-haired man. Kakashi stood there with his nose in a book but lifted a lazy eye to observe her work. He smiled at her, raising a hand in greeting. "You startled me." She sighed angrily but was secretly pleased to see the man and at his compliment. He gave a little laugh. "That is one of the jobs of a shinobi. Though it looks like you are getting there fast, Naru puffed up proudly. Kakashi gave another chuckle, snapping his book closed. He gave her a searching look, then his eye curved happily upward in a cheerful look. "Looks like you have been making progress in your chakra suppression too. Man, did I sure miss out." Naru tilted her head at his last comment, to which he filled her in. "I was late to the team selection for the new graduates. So, I didn't get my first picks. I wanted to come see what I was missing out on." Naru frowned and wilted a bit. So Kakashi wouldn't be her new sensei she had hoped, but… Ma, Kakashi rubbed the back of his head, "The teacher you got will probably be better on getting your skills rounded out anyway. I'm just a bit jealous of his team. I'll probably fail my team anyway, so it doesn't really matter." Naru perked up. "Wait, you know who my sensei is? Who are they? Who else is on my team?" "What?" Kakashi sighed. "See ya, kid." And he disappeared into a poof of smoke. Naru stomped her foot in frustration, but was resigned to wait until the next day to hear her team assignment. With another silent sigh, she hopped off to return to the Aburame compound. Naru skipped through the doors of the only Aburame home she had ever really gone into. There was the sound of soft voices talking from the kitchen. She could pick out Minami's soothing alto and Shino's quiet tenor and assumed that the elder Aburame man had gone to do shinobi council type things. She entered the kitchen with a grin, causing the two other occupants to halt their conversation. "Naru, there you are. Come here so I can check your hands before you do more damage to yourself," Minami said wearily, but with her ever-present kind smile. Naru stuck out her tongue, but obeyed, dropping the bag she had packed and skipping to sit at the counter beside Shino. Shino turned to look at her, glancing over her arms with a frown. Naru gave him a reassuring smile as Minami unwrapped the bandages. The woman tutted softly as the burns were revealed, looking ghastly, but better than it had been the night before. She smeared more balm on them and re-wrapped up to Naru's elbows. Naru sighed as some of the sting that had been building up all morning began to recede. "Well, I'd like to stay and chat with you both," Minami winked at the duo, "but I have some errands of my own to get done." "Goodbye, mother," Shino replied, watching his mother retreat from the room. As soon as she left the doorway he turned back to Naru. From the creases in his forehead Naru could tell he was examining her behind his black-tinted shades. "How are you feeling?" "Fine now." Naru signed to him cheerfully, swinging her legs from the chair she sat in. Shino looked at her for a moment longer, then looked away with a nod. Naru's smile drooped as she observed the tension he still held in his shoulders and expression that she could see. His bugs buzzed loudly, louder than Naru had ever remembered them being. She frowned and leaned closer to him, touching his shoulder gingerly to gain his attention. "Shino. Is something wrong?" The boy pushed up his glasses and sighed, seeming to be searching for words. The blonde girl worried her lower lip between her teeth in anxiousness. After a few moments he looked up at her again, seriousness in every line of his face. "Do you trust me?" Naru paused a moment, shocked by the question. She had thought it was obvious. "Yes. Of course. Why would you think I don't?" "It is only," Shino paused, "it bothers me that you felt you could not come to me after you failed your exam. You said last night that you were afraid but knew I would not abandon you. What were you afraid of?" Naru hurried to reassure and correct the boy. "I was afraid of letting you down, not that you would leave me on my own." I didn't want to tell you that I had failed because you believed so much in me." Naru wilted, her shoulders and head drooping, as she was reminded of the intense shame she had felt. A hand landed on her shoulder and she looked up. "I would not have been disappointed in you," Shino explained softly, "we would have figured it out together." Naru nodded, "I know that now. I'm sorry." The tension drained from his spine as he relaxed. He nodded and his cheeks raised from behind his collar. "No apology needed. I understand. I am simply glad you trust me." Naru hesitated, then signed, "You trust me too, right?" Shino didn't hesitate to give a firm nod, "Yes." Naru sighed in relief, smiling brightly. Shino smiled back, pushing up his glasses. Watching the motion, Naru jumped up and grabbed the bag she packed, pulling out a small plain-wrapped gift. She grinned widely as she resumed her seat. "You just reminded me that I have a graduation present for you." She thrust the package into his hands. Shino hesitated, then pulled open the tie and opened the flaps of the box. "I thought you would need something that wouldn't fall off as easily for missions," Naru began nervously, "plus I think they look kinda cool." Shino pulled out of the box a pair of dark-tinted goggles. They were built sturdily and had a no-shine finish, perfect for keeping glare out of his eyes. Naru watched anxiously for his reaction, wringing her hands. After a moment she saw his cheeks rise from behind his collar as he looked up at her. "Thank you. These are perfect." Naru smiled in relief. Shino stood up and picked up the box on the table, handing it to the girl. "I have gotten a graduation present for you as well." Naru wasted no time in tearing off the paper and opening the long flat box. Inside, underneath some tissue paper, were a pair of ninja gloves the same brown shade as her pants. She slipped them on quickly over her bandages, marveling at the soft texture. They reached her elbows and fit snugly around her forearms. On the back of her hand sat a metal plate, just like the one on her headband. However, unlike her headband, there was no leaf engraving, but instead a white rose. "I did some research," Shino explained as he saw her looking at the plates. "The white rose is a symbol of a new beginning, a new chapter. I thought it appropriate to." Naru had attacked him in a hug, beaming her thanks. He smiled and nodded his head to her unspoken words. After a moment they parted and Shino spoke, "Well, let us go test out how stealthy you can now be with some proper clothing to hide in, The next day found both Naru, wearing her new gloves, and Shino, new goggles firmly in place, sitting in their old classroom, anxiously awaiting their team assignments. Naru could hear Shino's bugs making more noise than usual, but that could partly be caused by the doubling in size of his colony. Shino had told Naru that with his graduation, he had been awarded his full colony of bugs, which Naru thought was rather awesome. Naru told Shino about her interaction with Kakashi the previous day, to which he met and nodded. "Perhaps it is best if he is not your sensei." He had said after a few moments, "It is better to have someone new that could bring other things to your skills." When put that way, Naru fully agreed, but was still wary of who she did end up with. But more than that, on whether she would end up on Shino's team or not. Before she could ponder more about it, Iruka entered the room alone. She heard some of her classmates whispering about the whereabouts of Mizuki. She grimaced at the thought of the trickster, and she could tell Shino was just as perturbed by the sound of his bugs growing louder for a moment. "Alright," Iruka said, commanding the room into silence, "I have here your team selections. I just wanted to say congratulations for making it to Genin, and good luck." The kind teacher started down the list, Naru growing more anxious by the second. He cycled through the first teams, filled with names Naru didn't really know all that well. Team 7 Uchiha Sasuke, Haruno Sakura, and Inuzuka Kiba with Hatake Kakashi. Sasuke scoffed to himself and Sakura cheered loudly. Kiba gave a groan and pouted, and Naru pitied him slightly. Team 8 Nara Shikamaru, Hyuga Hinata and Yamanaka Ino with Yuhi Kurenai. Team 10 Uzumaki Naru gave a silent gasp, leaning forward in her seat. Aburame Shino, both gave a sigh of relief, smiling to each other, and Akimichi Choji with Saratobi Asuma. Choji, from the row behind them, stopped chomping on his chips for a moment to give them a curious look, offering a tentative smile when the duo looked back at him. Naru beamed at the Akimichi boy, while Shino offered a polite nod. "Now." Iruka clapped his hands, setting his clipboard down, "Your senseis should be by to pick you up soon." At once, a couple of jounin walked through the door, calling out their respective team numbers. A man with a goatee and spiked black hair scanned the crowd of students, settling on where Shino and Naru were, and Choji behind them. Team 10. Naru hopped up at once, skipping to the bottom of the stairs. Shino followed behind her at a slower pace, hands in his pockets. Naru could hear the crinkling of Choji's chip bag as he stood, and the quiet "See you Shikamaru." He gave to his friend. The tall jounin, presumably Asuma, gave the three a small smile as they stood before him. "Let's go talk for a bit. How about training ground 10? All three Genin nodded, following the man in silence as he turned out the door. Naru turned backwards to wave at Iruka in a parting gesture, to which he smiled and waved back. As they trekked towards Konoha's training grounds, Asuma and Shino seemed content to stay in silence, while Choji was quietly chomping on his snack. Naru, however, was practically vibrating in excitement. She had trouble keeping her steps quiet enough when all she wanted to do was stomp and skip to get some of her energy out. Naru? Naru turned to look at the boy walking beside her. Choji blushed a bit but continued in what he wanted to say. Shikamaru told me one time that he thought that you can't talk, is that true? Naru hesitated for a moment but gave a nod in the affirmative. Choji simply blinked, then shrugged and said, "Oh, okay. I was just wondering." Naru noticed Asuma looking at them from the corner of his eye before he turned to look ahead again. Soon enough they arrived at the training ground. Asuma took a seat in the grass, his new students following suit. He looked around at them, a lazy smile on his face. "And here I was worried I would get a loud group," he joked. The three Genin said nothing to this, simply blinking at the jounin. Asuma chuckled a bit nervously, rubbing the back of his head. He pulled a cigarette from his hip pouch and lit it. "Well, I'm sure you all are, well, most of you, sorry, we'll be talking soon enough. For now, how about some introductions? I'll go first. I am Suratobi Asuma. I am a jounin level ninja. I enjoy smoking and playing games like shogi and go. As far as strengths, I like using my chakra blades and various jutsu. Weaknesses, gain jutsu. Your turn." The three looked around at each other. Shino gave a sigh and started talking. "My name is Aburame Shino. I enjoy training with my bugs and Naru. My strengths are my bug techniques and tracking. My weakness is to jutsu." Choji went next. "I am Akimichi Choji. I like food. My strength is my clan techniques and strength. My weakness is gain jutsu, I guess." Naru jumped up to sign her introduction, which Shino translated automatically for Choji's sake. "I am Uzumaki Naru. I like training with Shino and making trap designs. My strength is stealth and traps, and my weakness is jutsu because I literally cannot do any." Asuma frowned a bit at this and raised a surprised eyebrow, but shook it off a moment later. "Well, that wasn't exactly a lot of information, but I suppose we'll learn more about each other soon enough. So, tomorrow morning we will meet here at 9 am sharp. There is a traditional Konoha test that you must pass in order to stay a genin. So, that means come ready." Asuma gave them a last smile before shouting bye and disappearing in a poof of smoke. The three sat there stunned for a moment before Choji commented, "When do we get to learn that?" Shino shrugged, standing up and dusting himself off. Choji and Naru followed his example. Choji folded up his empty chip bag and put it in his pocket. "Well, I'll see you two tomorrow, I guess." "Be seeing you," Shino replied, while Naru gave an enthusiastic wave at Choji's retreating figure. "Come on, Naru," Shino said after Choji had disappeared into the trees, "let us go see what mother and father know about this Asuma." The end. So how was this part? I hope you like it. And if you like it, share this part with your friends and like the video too. And don't forget to subscribe our channel for daily awesome fanfiction. Okay, it's time for me to go. Bye bye.